She came 2,000 miles on a promise and a lie. She lay bleeding in the mud of a frontier street while 60 men watched her die and not one step forward. Then a shadow fell across her face and a voice she had never heard before said, "Step away from the lady." This is the story of the afternoon a Boston girl was delivered to a monster and the mountain man who carried her home. The Colorado sky was the color of old iron that afternoon. Snow fell in thick, wet flakes, the kind that melted into mud the moment they touched the ground. The main street of Oak Haven was a trough of filth, horse manure, spilled whiskey, blood. Cordelia Ashby lay in that mud, her cheek pressed against a frozen puddle, her honey blonde hair once pinned neat in the Boston style fanned out now in tangled ropes soaked dark with rain. The cornflower blue eyes that had once read Shakespeare by candlelight in her father's library stared up at a gray sky she no longer recognized. One of those eyes was swelling shut. Her ribs burned with every breath. Somewhere above her boots moved across the warped wood of the saloon's boardwalk. Men passed. Women watched from shuttered windows. No one knelt. No one spoke. No one came. She heard the jangle of a pistol belt, the hiss of a struck match, the deputy miller lighting a cigar 2 storefronts down, looking everywhere but at her. The coppery taste of her own blood pooled against her tongue. She closed her eyes. This, she thought, is where I die. In the dirt of a town that does not even know my name. Then she heard the footsteps. Not rushed, not loud. Heavy, deliberate, the weight of a man who had been walking in mountains for a decade and did not know how to move any other way. The boots stopped inches from her face. She saw mud caked to buckskin leggings. She saw scarred leather. She saw the dark shape of a bearskin coat and a shadow falling across her. A hand came down. It was the largest hand she had ever seen, calloused to stone, scarred across the knuckles from frostbite and trapping wire and 100 winters of honest work. It came down through the falling snow like something offered from another world, and it did not shake. A voice rumbled above her. Deep, quiet, certain. "You're home now, darling. Come with us." Cordelia Ashby raised her swollen eyes, and through blood and tears and failing light, she saw the man whose hand she would hold for the next 32 years of her life. She did not know that yet. She only saw a stranger, and she took his hand. The camera of memory pulled away from that muddy street and drifted backward. East, across mountains the color of bruised plums, across the great flat yellow of the plains, across the Mississippi brown and slow, across the green Ohio Valley, all the way to the narrow brick lanes of Beacon Hill, Boston, in the soft, honeyed summer of 1879. To the beginning. Edmund Ashby had been a good man. That was the first thing to remember about him. Not clever the way Boston merchants were supposed to be clever. Not ruthless. Good. He had run the Ashby Shipping Company from a cramped office on Long Wharf for 32 years, and in all that time he had never cheated a captain, nor shorted a stevedore, nor lied to his wife. When his wife had died of consumption the winter his daughter turned 12, Edmund had kept the house exactly as she left it, her sewing basket on the parlor chair, her pearl collar beside the looking glass, her cameo brooch in its velvet box, as if she had only stepped out for tea. Cordelia grew up in that house of preserved grief. Her father called her Delia the way her mother once had. He taught her to read Shakespeare by candlelight when she was 6. He took her to symphony concerts in the autumn and to Harvard lectures her cousins said no respectable girl should attend. By the time she was 21, she could name every constellation in the summer sky and could play 3 Chopin nocturnes from memory and could recite the balcony speech from Romeo and Juliet in a voice that made the old servant Hattie cry into her apron. She was in every way the Boston parlors understood a treasure. And so the engagement came easily. Percival Sterling, of the Back Bay Sterlings, dark eyes, thin mustache, a laugh that did not quite reach his eyes. He asked for her hand on the porch of the Somerset Club on a June evening, with the lamplighter's ladder clicking behind them, And Cordelia had said yes because it was the thing a girl of her station was supposed to say, and because she believed the way young women in well-kept houses believed that love would follow. 2 weeks later, three of her father's ships went down off Cape Cod in a summer squall that came out of nowhere. The uninsured ones. She watched her father read the telegrams at the breakfast table. She watched the color leave his face. She watched him fold the papers carefully, the way he folded every important document, and set them beside his coffee cup. He smiled at her. Delia, he said, will manage. He died 4 days later. His heart, the doctor said. His heart simply stopped. Cordelia buried her father on a Tuesday in July. The bank took the house on Thursday. On Sunday afternoon, sitting in a parlor that was no longer hers with her trunks packed and the carriage waiting, she received a folded card from Percival Sterling. She opened it with numb fingers. I marry a lady, he had written. Not a penniless girl. 3 lines. No signature. She did not cry. She had cried herself empty at her father's grave, and there was nothing left in her to spend. She simply folded the note, once laid it on the parlor table beside her mother's cameo brooch, and walked out of the only life she had ever known. Aunt Henrietta took her in. Henrietta Ashby was Edmund's older sister, a woman of rigid posture and corseted opinions, who lived in a narrow house on Pinckney Street with 3 cats and a housekeeper she paid in grievances. She had disapproved of Edmund's marriage. She had disapproved of Cordelia's education. She disapproved, in fact, of most things that had been invented since 1855. You will stay, Henrietta announced, and on the evening Cordelia arrived until arrangements can be made. Arrangements Cordelia soon learned had been in a governess position in upstate New York, or perhaps a Shaker community in Maine, or perhaps nothing at all. Henrietta had not decided yet. In the meantime, Cordelia was expected to rise before dawn to mend her aunt's stockings, to read aloud from the more improving passages of Cotton Mather after supper, and to remember every hour of every day that she was eating food she had not earned. A burden. That was the word her aunt used when she thought Cordelia could not hear. She grew thin, her sleeves began to hang loose at the wrists. The Chopin in her head faded under a hum of humiliation that would not quit. At night she lay in the cramped third-floor room that smelled of camphor, and she whispered to the dark over and over, there must be another life. There must. There must. The advertisement found her on a rainy afternoon in September. She had walked to the little bookshop on Charles Street to return a volume her aunt had not approved of, and while she waited for the shopkeeper to mark his ledger, her eye fell on a creased newspaper left on the counter. The National Police Gazette, a shabby publication the sort gentlemen hid inside respectable journals. It had fallen open to the matrimonial column. Her gloved finger moved down the page, almost without her permission, and stopped. Gentleman of means, Colorado Territory, cattle rancher 40 miles north of the town of Oak Haven, seeks correspondence with refined lady of good character, view to matrimony, spacious home beside mountain lake, climate healthful, life tranquil. Mr. T. Crow, oh yeah, of the Silver Keg, Oak Haven, Colorado Territory. The words were ordinary. The life they promised was not. She tore the page out carefully along the fold, tucked it into her reticule, and walked home through the rain with a heart beating faster than it had beaten in months. She wrote that night a short letter. Honest, she named her education, she named her losses, she did not beg. The reply came in 3 weeks. It was written on good paper in a hand that slanted elegantly, and it quoted Byron in the second paragraph. By candlelight, I imagine you, it said, a woman of rare quality in a parlor too small for your soul. By daylight, I consider the quiet hills of my ranch and the empty chair beside my hearth, and I allow myself the hope that these 2 scenes might one day become one. Cordelia read the letter 3 times and then pressed it to her chest and wept. Over the following 8 weeks, 12 more letters crossed the continent. Mr. T. Crow wrote of autumn aspens turning to gold above his ranch house, of a creek that froze hard enough to skate on in January, of the small library he had built and the piano his late mother had shipped in from St. Louis and the 2 good horses in his stable. He wrote in the ninth letter that he had never married, that he was 38 years old, and that he wished above all things to build a family with a woman who could read Shakespeare by firelight. In the 12th letter, he enclosed a railway voucher and a stagecoach ticket in a hand-drawn map. Cordelia did not tell her aunt. She sold her mother's pearl necklace to a discreet jeweler on Washington Street for $50 in silver coin, which she sewed into the lining of her father's old oak traveling trunk. She packed the cameo brooch, the Shakespeare, the small cloth-bound Emily Dickinson her father had given her on her 18th birthday, 3 modest dresses, 1 navy blue traveling gown, a Bible her mother had written her name in round girlish script the year she was married. On the morning of October the 3rd, 1879, she left Aunt Henrietta's house before dawn. She left no note. She carried the trunk to the train station herself, her breath ghosting in the cold air, and at 6 o'clock she boarded the westbound cars of the Boston and Albany Railroad with a ticket to a town she could not find on any map in her aunt's library. She was 23 years old. She had never been kissed. She had in that trunk everything she owned in the world. She believed with the unshakable belief of the very young that she was riding toward love. 11 days. That was how long the journey took. 11 days of rattling cars and smoke and strangers and bad coffee. The Alleghenies rose and fell outside her window. The Ohio Valley opened green. The Mississippi slid under the train at St. Louis brown and vast and indifferent. Kansas unrolled like a yellow bedsheet to the horizon. She wrote in her journal every night small careful sentences trying to hold each new astonishment in a vocabulary that had been built in a Boston parlor. And then the mountains. She saw them first at dawn on the 10th day, a jagged dark line at the edge of the plains, and she pressed her palm flat to the cold window and thought, that is where he is. That is where my life begins. She transferred to the stagecoach at Pueblo. A sour driver with a patched eye did not speak to her for 3 days. The road climbed, the air thinned, snow began to salt the peaks. The other passengers left one by one at mining camps and military posts until on the final afternoon, Cordelia rode alone in the jolting wooden box as it swung up a switchback road between walls of pine. She leaned forward. She pressed her face to the window. She saw Oak Haven, and her heart, which had climbed every mile of that 11-day journey on wings she had made of paper and hope, fell. There was no ranch, there was no lake. There was a single muddy street gouged into a mountainside, saloons leaning against each other for support, a boneyard of broken wagons behind the livery, a row of shuttered shacks with painted women sitting on the upstairs porches in the cold. She heard a gunshot somewhere off beyond the assayer's office. No one seemed to notice. The coach pulled up in front of the Silver Keg Saloon. A man was waiting on the boardwalk. He was broad in the shoulders, tall, expensively dressed for this place in a black wool coat and a clean linen shirt, dark hair oiled back, a pearl-handled revolver on his hip. His smile when he saw her step down did something with his mouth that was not a smile at all. It did not reach his eyes. His eyes were the color of chipped flint. "Miss Ashby," he said, "welcome." She did not know yet that the poems had been bought from a broken schoolmaster over a bottle of rye, that the ranch did not exist, that the piano did not exist, that the man in front of her had never in his life read a line of Byron. She knew only that the shoulders were wrong, the mouth was wrong, the hand he offered her was soft, a saloon keeper's hand, and something in her stomach. Some quiet animal that had been warned by 23 years of being her mother's daughter whispered no. But her trunk stood beside her in the mud, and the coach was already turning, and she had crossed 2,000 miles. She put her hand in his. There was no wedding to speak of. There was a back room in the assayer's office where a drunken circuit preacher, whose name she would never learn, mumbled 5 sentences over a water-stained Bible. There was a scratched line on a ledger. There was no ring. Crow tied a strip of dyed leather around her wrist as the preacher said amen, the way a man might mark a heifer. She signed her name in her small Boston handwriting, Cordelia Ashby Crow. The ink was still wet when he pulled her by the elbow up a flight of unlit stairs at the back of the Silver Keg. The room that was to be her new home was 10 feet by 12, one window smeared, a sagging bed with a stained quilt, a cracked mirror, a washstand whose pitcher was empty, a smell of old whiskey in the boards. "When will we go to the ranch?" she asked. It was the only thing she could think to say. Thaddeus Crow laughed. It was not a laugh she had ever heard before. It came from the chest of a man who was deeply amused by someone else's pain. "Ranch," he said. He closed the door. "There's no ranch, Boston. There's this." He gestured at the bare walls. "This is yours now. Work starts tomorrow." He crossed the room toward her. "Please," she whispered. Her back was against the washstand. "Please, sir, I have had a long journey. Give me time." He stopped. He looked at her the way a man looks at livestock at a county fair. Appraising, calculating. "1 week," he said. "That is what I will give you. 1 week to earn your keep downstairs. Then you are my wife in the proper fashion. You understand me?" She nodded. Because there was nothing else to do, he left. The door closed. She heard the key turn in the lock. And Cordelia Ashby, who had 11 days earlier believed she was riding toward love, sank down onto the rag rug beside her trunk and pressed her forehead to the worn oak and prayed for the first time in her life to be allowed to die quickly. 2 weeks. She would live the next 2 weeks in a kind of waking death. She scrubbed the saloon floor at dawn on her hands and knees. She carried trays of sour beer between tables of men who did not look at her as if she were a woman so much as a thing that might be used if the owner allowed it. She learned to keep her eyes lowered. She learned to flinch before the slap came rather than after. She learned that Crow enjoyed watching her flinch and that he enjoyed striking her more when she did not. She tried to write to Aunt Henrietta. Crow found the letter in her apron pocket and burned it in the pot-belly stove while she watched. The next day, he found her last $2 and took those too. On the 7th morning, he came upstairs while she was making the bed, and she understood from the way he closed the door behind him that the week of grace was finished. She fled into the kitchen. She locked herself in the pantry. He did not follow. He laughed through the wood. "You're only making it harder on yourself, Boston." That night in the small hours, the pantry door creaked open from the outside. Cordelia raised a cleaver she had taken from the block. Her hand shook so badly she could barely hold it. A girl stepped into the pantry with a single candle, red hair tangled, a face scrubbed of paint, a thin bruise the shape of a man's knuckles along her jaw. "Put that down," the girl whispered. "It's me." She was perhaps 20 years old, freckles across her nose, a cheap calico wrapper pulled tight over a white nightdress. She carried a hunk of brown bread and a tin cup of warm water. "Bess Finley," she whispered. "I work the rooms upstairs. Eat. He's drunk in the front parlor." "You have maybe an hour." Cordelia did not take the bread at first. She did not know how. Kindness had become so strange a currency she had forgotten its shape. "Eat," the girl hissed, "then listen." Cordelia ate. She had not known she was starving. The bread tasted like the bread her mother had baked on Sunday afternoons in a house she was no longer sure had ever existed. Bess sat on the pantry floor. She spoke fast, glancing at the door. "Ain't no law here," she whispered. "Not any that matters. Miller is on Crow's payroll. Judge is bought in Denver. Preacher is a drunk. Women in the boarding houses, they all see you, Delia. They all pity you. But they all got their own men and their own walls, and not one of them is going to open a door for you. You understand me, I understand. So you listen careful," Bess said, "because there is only one thing. Up the mountain, 40 miles north, there is a basin with a frozen lake. 3 brothers live there, the Calloway brothers. Silas, Amos, Wyatt. They come down twice a year with furs. People say Silas killed a man with his hands in Cheyenne. People say Amos tracks like an Indian and shoots like a devil. People say Wyatt is the gentlest man in the territory and that the other 2 will burn the world down for anyone he takes a shine to." Cordelia listened. "They don't come to saloons," Bess whispered. They don't drink. They don't speak. They buy salt and coffee and powder at Henderson's, and they leave. They ain't been near a woman in 10 years, not that anybody knows of. But they ain't like the men in this town. They are mountain men, Delia. They keep their word or they die trying. Why are you telling me this? Cordelia whispered. Bess did not answer for a long time. Because I came west on a ticket too, she said finally. Just like you. Mine was for a husband who died of cholera 2 weeks before I got off the train. And Crow found me at the station with nowhere to go. And I've been here 4 years, Delia. 4 years. I am telling you because if you get a chance, even half a chance, you take it. You take it and you do not look back. For me. You do that for me. She pressed the cup of warm water into Cordelia's hand. Winter always ends, she whispered. Remember that. Winter always ends. Then she blew the candle out and was gone. In the dark of the pantry, Cordelia pressed the tin cup to her split lip, and she whispered the words back to the blackness over and over like a prayer. Winter always ends. Winter always ends. The next morning was the morning. Thaddeus Crow came down from his private office with a face the color of a thundercloud and a fistful of papers in his hand. He threw them on the bar in front of her. Sign, he said. She knew what they were before she read them. Her father's lawyer in Boston had written her 3 times care of the Oak Haven post office. Crow had intercepted every letter. The papers on the bar were the title deed to a small plot of land in western Massachusetts that had belonged to her grandfather and was now by the terms of her father's will legally hers. 5 acres, a stone cottage, a hayfield beside a narrow river. It was the last thing on earth with Edmund Ashby's name beside hers. Sign it over, Crow said. Now. The saloon was quiet. A few early miners nursed their coffee, cut with whiskey. Bess stood behind the bar, polishing a glass with eyes that would not meet Cordelia's. A fire crackled in the stove. Outside, a weak autumn sun was trying to push its way through the clouds. Cordelia looked at the papers. She thought of her father folding telegrams at his breakfast table. She thought of his voice saying, "We'll manage." She thought of her mother's pearl necklace and her Shakespeare, and the Boston girl she had been 11 weeks ago, who had believed love would follow a yes spoken on a June porch. All of it had been taken. All of it was gone. Except this. 5 acres. A cottage. The last shred of the life she had come from. No, she said. The word was so small, hardly a word at all. A breath, really. Crow went very still. She watched his right hand close slowly into a fist on the bar top. Say that again, he said softly. No, she said, I will not sign. What happened next she would remember for the rest of her life, not in a single rush of events, but in separated images, like photographs laid out on a table. His hand in her hair, the wooden stairs coming up to meet her face. The swinging doors of the Silver Voyage slamming open against the outside walls. The cold shock of mud on her cheek. The taste of copper. The first kick in the side and the sound her ribs made like green wood snapping. The ring of boots as the town gathered. 50 pairs, 60, miners with their hats in their hands. Gamblers, drifters, the grocer, the assayer, 2 boys of 12 who should not have been watching and watched anyway. Deputy Miller leaning against the post of the boardwalk opposite, striking a match against his thumbnail, lighting a cigar. And Crow's voice roaring. She is a thief and a liar. You all hear me. She is my wife and my property, and any man who touches her answers to me. Leave her in the filth. Let her remember what she is, and then the stillness afterward. The murmuring crowd beginning to break up. The shutters of the boarding house across the street closing one by one. The thin silver of the church bell over in the next canyon ringing noon for a god who was not apparently in attendance in Oak Haven this afternoon. And Cordelia Ashby lying in the middle of the street, her hair in the mud, her ribs on fire, her one good eye staring at a gray sky, finishing the prayer she had begun 11 days before. Take me quickly, Lord. Please, take me quickly. She did not know lying there that at the far end of the street, in front of Henderson's General Store, three men had stopped loading their pack mules. She did not know that a giant in a dark buckskin coat had laid his scarred hand on the neck of his lead mule, and that the lead mule, sensing the stillness that had come over the man who raised him from a foal, had ceased chewing. She did not know that Silas Calloway was staring down the muddy length of Main Street with eyes the color of old whiskey held up to firelight, and that something 10 years buried was moving in his chest like a sleeping animal beginning to turn. She did not know that Amos Calloway had closed his hand around the butt of the Winchester in his saddle scabbard without thinkings, or that young Wyatt, the quiet one, had taken 2 slow steps forward and was now staring at his eldest brother, waiting for the word. Silas Amos said very low, "Silas, do you see it?" "I see it," Silas said. "It is 3 against a whole town," Wyatt said, calm, as if he were commenting on the weather. "Are you certain?" Silas did not answer. He was thinking instead of a winter night 10 years past, of a house in a poor ward of St. Louis, of his young wife Martha burning with cholera in a corner bed, and of himself on a doctor's doorstep in the Lafayette Square neighborhood begging through a locked and painted door, of the coachman who had finally been sent to drive him from the property, of the final small rattle of Martha's breath at dawn the next morning, and the way her hand, which had been braiding his hair the night before, had stopped being the hand of a living woman and become something else. He thought of the vow he had made over a grave. Never again. Never again will I stand and watch the strong crush the weak. Not while I have hands. He did not answer Wyatt. He simply tied the lead mule to the hitching post, patted her neck once, and began to walk. His boots hit the boardwalk in an even rhythm. Amos fell in on his left, Wyatt on his right. No hurry, no haste. 3 men moving down a muddy frontier street, the way a slow, heavy storm moves down a mountain, and the crowd that was still gathered in front of the Silver Keg Saloon, without anyone saying a word, began to part for them. Thaddeus Crow was winding up for another kick. He did not see them coming. His right boot was drawn back. His face was flushed purple with the pleasure of a cruelty no one was going to stop. The kick never landed. A shin, thick as a fence post, wrapped in worn buckskin, absorbed the blow without flinching. Crow looked up. He saw towering over him the biggest man he had ever stood this close to. A man with a thick brown beard frosted with melting snow. A man with eyes that were not angry the way saloon eyes were angry. Eyes that were calm the way a drawn knife is calm. "What the hell?" Crow sputtered. "Calloway, this is town business. This is my wife. You step back now. A woman ain't property," Silas Calloway said. His voice was low, quiet. It carried the entire length of the street without rising. "And a man who hits one, he said, is less than dirt." Crow's hand twitched toward the pearl-handled revolver on his hip. Amos Calloway's Colt cleared leather so fast the sound of it, the oiled rush of steel against holster, reached the ears of the crowd an instant before anyone saw it move. The muzzle stopped 2 inches from Thaddeus Crow's forehead. Amos smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Friend," Amos said softly, "if that hand moves 1 more inch, my brother is going to bury you right here in this mud, and I am going to help him, and our little brother yonder is going to play us a hymn on his mouth harp while we dig." Wyatt behind them, the shotgun broken open across his forearm, gave a small, polite nod to no one in particular. Deputy Miller across the street suddenly decided that his cigar needed to be relit. He turned very carefully toward the wall of the dry goods store and began to strike matches. Crow swallowed. He released the grip of his revolver. His hand went back to his side. Silas Calloway did not look at him again. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the deputy whose ignited match was trembling against the wind. He turned his back on Thaddeus Crow, which was the most deliberate insult a mountain man could offer a saloon king, and he knelt in the mud beside the small, battered woman who lay there. She was so much smaller up close than he had imagined. Her hair was the color of sourwood honey. One eye was swelling shut, and a cut ran across her lip, and her breathing came in small, shallow catches. A bruise was blooming along her jaw and in the exact shape of a knuckle. Her dress, a navy blue traveling gown that had been good work once, was ripped along the shoulder seam. She flinched when his shadow fell across her. Her arms went up to protect her face. Something in the chest of Silas Calloway, which had been a piece of cold granite for 10 years, cracked down the middle. "Ma'am," he said. His voice had gone strange, softer than he had heard it in a decade. "Ma'am, I ain't going to hurt you. Look at me. Look at me now." She lowered her arms an inch. She opened her good eye. He was the largest man she had ever seen up close. His beard was dark and thick, and she could see snow melting in it. His shoulders blocked the gray sky, but his eyes under the wide brim of a sweat-stained hat were the warmest things she had seen in 1,000 miles. "You're safe," he said. "We have got you. Do you hear me, darling? You are safe now." And he extended the hand, the scarred, calloused hand she would come to know better than her own. And he said the words that would follow her for the rest of her life. "You're home now, darling. Come with us." She looked up the length of that arm, past the worn sleeve, and the bare-skinned shoulder into his face. And then she looked past him at Crow, whose eyes held pure venom, and then at Deputy Miller, who was still pretending to light a cigar that had been lit for 5 minutes, and then at the shuttered windows of the boarding houses, and then at Bess Finley, who stood in the doorway of the silver keg with both hands pressed against her mouth and tears running down her dirty face. Bess lowered her hands. She nodded once. A small, fierce nod. "Go," Bess mouthed. "Go." Cordelia Ashby, who had crossed 2,000 miles for a lie, and who had been left to die in the dirt of a town that did not know her name, slid her small, muddy hand into the hand of a stranger. His fingers closed over hers. Warm, steady, enormous. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. When her ribs protested and her knees would not hold, he gathered her up against his chest the way a father gathers a sleeping child, and he turned, and without looking back at Thaddeus Crow or Deputy Miller or the staring crowd, he began to walk. Amos walked backward on his left, Colt's steady eyes never leaving Crow. Wyatt walked backward on his right, shotgun resting easy across his forearm, eyes on the deputy. "A posse," Crow choked out at last. "A posse by morning. Calloway, you hear me? You are stealing my wife." Silas paused. He did not turn his head. He only spoke over his shoulder, and his voice carried down the street the way thunder carries down a canyon. "I will be waiting, Crow. Bring shovels. You are going to need them." Then he walked on. Snow began to fall harder. Oak Haven's main street, with its saloon doors still swinging and its shutters still closed and its deputies still facing a wall, faded behind them into a blur of falling white. In the doorway of the silver keg, Bess Finley watched the giant in the bearskin coat carry the small golden-haired woman toward the 3 pack mules tied at the end of the street. She watched him set her side saddle on the lead Appaloosa with a tenderness that had nothing to do with how such a man was built. She watched Wyatt Calloway hand up a wool blanket and Amos Calloway tuck a canteen into the saddlebag, and Silas take the bridle in his scarred left hand and begin the long, slow climb up the switchback road that led out of town and into the mountains. She watched them until the snow swallowed them. Then Bess Finley turned and walked slowly back into the saloon. She moved behind the bar. She lifted a loose floorboard she had known about for 3 years, and from the space beneath it, she drew out an oiled canvas pouch, flat and rectangular, the size of a small ledger. Inside that pouch were letters, 4 of them, written on silver keg stationery in Thaddeus Crow's own hand, addressed to a federal judge in Denver and to 2 territorial land officers. Bess had stolen them one by one over the past 18 months, every time Crow was too drunk to lock the office, and she had kept them for a day she was not sure would ever come. She looked at the pouch. She looked at the door the 3 Calloway brothers had carried Cordelia Ashby through. Bess Finley, who had arrived west on a ticket 4 years earlier and had buried whatever Boston girl she once was under 4 years of Oak Haven dust, whispered a single sentence to the empty saloon. "Winter always ends. She tucked the pouch under her apron against her body, against her heart, and she went upstairs to pack a carpet bag. High above Oak Haven on the switchback road, Silas Calloway walked beside the Appaloosa, one scarred hand on the bridle, one scarred hand resting lightly on the knee of the small, shivering woman in the saddle above him. She had not spoken yet. Shock, cold, the pain in her ribs. She swayed with every step of the horse. He glanced up at her once. Her hair, tangled with mud and half undone, caught a stray shaft of late sun breaking through the clouds, and for a moment the hair was the color of honey poured through glass. Her eyes were fixed on some distance he could not see. "You're home now, darling," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "The mountain chose you. We will get you home." Ahead of them, the pines rose black against the whitening sky. The trail climbed. The air thinned. The town of Oak Haven disappeared beneath them as the storm came in. What she did not know, and what Silas Calloway did not know, and what Amos and Wyatt Calloway riding alongside did not know, and what Bess Finley climbing the stairs of the Silver Keg with a carpet bag in her hand did not know was this. 20 miles below, in the back room of the Silver Keg, Thaddeus Crow was already pouring himself a glass of rye with a hand that shook only slightly and reaching for pen and paper. By nightfall, a rider would be on the road to Missouri with $200 in gold coins sewn into his saddle. By sunrise in 3 days' time, the Brannon brothers, Cletus and Boyd, the nastiest pair of killers east of the Mississippi, would be nailing up their Kansas City rooming house door and riding west. The mountain had chosen Cordelia Ashby, but the mountain did not yet know what was coming for her. And neither did she. The switchback road climbed for 4 hours. Cordelia Ashby remembered almost none of it. She remembered the rhythm of the Appaloosa's walk beneath her. She remembered the hand on her knee, the enormous scarred hand that never closed, never squeezed, only rested there, a steady warmth through the thin wool of her torn skirt. She remembered Amos Calloway riding ahead, breaking the trail, and young Wyatt riding behind his shotgun, held loose across the pommel, watching the road they had climbed for any sign of pursuit. She remembered the snow falling harder as they rose until the pines on either side of the trail wore white mantles and the world smelled of cold sap and wood smoke from a chimney she could not yet see. She remembered Silas Calloway stopping the horse once halfway up the last steep pitch and lifting her down in his arms because she had begun to sway in the saddle. She remembered being carried. She remembered her cheek against the rough buckskin of his coat. She remembered thinking through a fog of pain and cold that he smelled like pine pitch and gun oil and leather and something else she could not name, something clean the way stone smells clean after rain. And then she remembered a door, a heavy oak door with iron hinges forged by hand. The door swung open and warmth rolled out like a tide, and she was carried across a threshold for the first time in her life. The cabin was not what she expected. She had crossed 2,000 miles on the promise of a ranch house and had been delivered instead to a room above a saloon. She had braced her heart somewhere on the climb for one more disappointment. A trapper's hovel, a dirt floor, smoke-blackened walls. What she saw instead when Silas set her gently down in a high-back pine chair beside a stone fireplace, large enough to roast a whole deer in, was a home. The floor was wide, plank smooth from 10 winters of boot traffic scrubbed clean with lye soap. The walls were tight, chinked, whitewashed in the lower courses where spark flew dark timber above. A heavy oak table stood in the center of the room, scarred by use, a half-finished set of moccasins on its surface, beside a thimble and a spool of sinew. One long wall was books, she counted without meaning to. 40 volumes, 50. A leather-bound Pilgrim's Progress, Gibbon's Roman Empire in 3 cracked volumes, a worn Shakespeare, a Bible with ribbon markers, 3 volumes of Cooper, a first edition of Melville that would have made the rare booksellers on Tremont Street weep. Above the books hung a row of rifles, each oiled to a dark gleam, each with its own peg. A Sharps buffalo gun, 2 Winchesters, a cap and ball carbine that looked older than she was. Beneath the window was a workbench with a leather apron draped over the corner. A set of small awls and wax threads laid out neat as a surgeon's instruments. Snowshoes hung on the far wall, their rawhide webbing still supple, their frames hand-shaped and pegged. A bunch of dried sage hung from a rafter beside a string of red peppers. The air smelled of cedar smoke and strong coffee and old leather and faintly of lavender. She would learn later that Wyatt Calloway planted a small square of lavender each spring on the south side of the woodshed because he said a home without the smell of a growing thing in it was only a shelter. Ma'am, Silas said. She had begun without knowing it to cry. The tears came silently. They cut clean lines through the mud on her cheeks. He knelt on one knee in front of her chair, not touching, only close. Ma'am, you are safe here. Look at me. She looked. His eyes were the color of good whiskey, held up to firelight, and they were now in this room with the door barred behind him and the snow falling outside on his mountain, the warmest thing she had ever seen. Amos is going to see to your horse and ours, he said quietly. Wyatt is going to heat water and bring blankets and set biscuits in the Dutch oven. You are going to sit here until you are warm, and then we are going to look at your ribs because I believe they are broke, and then we are going to feed you, and then we are going to put you to bed in the only bedroom in this house, which from tonight forward is yours. Do you understand me? She nodded. She could not speak yet. I am going to tell you the terms of this house now, he said, because you have been lied to enough in this life, and I will not add one word to that pile. This cabin has one bedroom through that door. It is yours. The three of us sleep on bedrolls in this main room or out in the workshop, which is warm. I will not cross the threshold of that bedroom unless you invite me. Neither will my brothers. Winter has 6 weeks yet to run. Come spring, if you wish to go down the mountain to Silvercliff and put yourself on a train east, we will carry you down, and we will pay your fare to Boston, and we will ask nothing of you. That is the arrangement. You do not owe us one thing for it. Her hand, without her permission, rose and covered her mouth. Why, she whispered. Why would you? Silas Calloway considered the question for a long moment, the firelight shifting in his beard. Because 10 years ago, he said at last in a city a long way from here, I stood on a doorstep in the rain, and I begged for help for somebody I loved, and the door stayed closed. Ever since then, ma'am, I cannot walk past a closed door. That is the short answer. The long answer is my own to carry. You rest now. He stood. He moved to the fire, built it up. She watched his hands. They were the hands of a man who had worked with every tool there was, who had dressed game and split wood and hand-forged the nails in his own front door. And they were, she noticed, gentle with the fire, the way a mother is gentle with a baby. He did not break the kindling. He cracked it along its grain. Wyatt Calloway came in from the kitchen side with a copper basin of steaming water and a stack of folded linen that smelled faintly of lavender. He was the youngest. She saw him clearly for the first time. 30 perhaps, tall, though not as tall as his eldest brother. Sand-colored hair, a little shaggy. Eyes like pale amber. A quiet face. He set the basin down beside her chair and did not quite meet her eyes. Mammy said, there is hot water and there is a flannel shirt here that will reach past your knees, which is the best we have got for you tonight. Behind that curtain yonder is the wash corner. I have put a stool there. If you are able, you can tend yourself. If you are not able, I will fetch my brother, and he has some knowledge of wounds from the war, and he will see to you respectful. You tell me. I can do it, she whispered. He nodded, relieved. There is one more thing, he said, quieter still. This house, you need not be afraid of any of us. I know that will not mean much from a stranger tonight. But I am telling you anyway because I would want my sister told if I had one. You are safer in this cabin than you have been in any room of your life. You understand me. The tears came again. She could not stop them. Wyatt Calloway reached into the pocket of his canvas shirt and produced a clean folded handkerchief, which he laid on the arm of the chair beside her, and then he stepped back, and then he was gone through the curtain. She washed alone behind the curtain. The water turned gray, then brown, then the color of old coffee. She bit her lip against the pain of drawing breath. The flannel shirt, when she put it on, was enormous. It fell to her shins. It smelled of cedar and of the man who had worn it before her. She sat back down by the fire in that shirt, her bare feet tucked under her, and for the first time in a month, she did not feel watched. The biscuits came out of the Dutch oven golden. Amos Calloway ducked in through the front door, stamping snow from his boots, a string of frozen rabbits, and a fresh-cut armload of stovewood in his arms. He stopped when he saw her by the fire in the flannel shirt, small in the large chair, and his face, which had been all sharp angles and bared teeth down, in Oakhaven softened all at once into something kind and a little shy. "Ma'am," he said, "Amos Calloway, I did not make a proper howdy on the road." "I apologize." "Mr. Calloway," she said. He grinned. "Oh, no, ma'am, that was our daddy. Call me Amos. Fellow yonder with the face like a funeral, that is my big brother Silas. The pretty one at the stove, Wyatt." He took a step closer, then stopped careful of her. "Ma'am, I got to tell you, my coffee is the worst coffee ever brewed west of the Mississippi. My brothers will warn you in their own time. I am warning you now. When Wyatt offers you his, take it. When I offer you mine, say you prefer water. It will save us both embarrassment." She laughed. The laugh surprised her. It caught her cracked rib, and she winced, and then she laughed again anyway. A small, weak laugh that came up out of her, like a thing she had forgotten the shape of. Silas at the fire did not look at her, but the small muscle along his jaw, which had been tight since Oakhaven, eased. They fed her rabbit stew from tin bowls and cornbread that Wyatt had made. They fed her in small spoonfuls at first because of her split lip. Amos told a long, rambling story about a pack mule named Millie, who had 3 summers back, opened a gate with her teeth, and let out every other animal on the place. Silas spoke hardly at all. Wyatt refilled her cup with hot, sweetened tea 3 times without asking. When she could not finish the bread, Amos ate it for her and told her he considered it his civic duty. After supper, Silas Calloway sat beside her by the fire with a strip of clean linen and a small tin of bear grease. And very carefully, with his eyes fixed respectfully on her face and not her body, he wound the linen around her ribs over the flannel shirt and drew it firm. "2 broke," he said quietly. "Maybe 3. They will knit in 6 weeks if you do not lift anything heavier than a coffee cup, and if you let us do the carrying, you will not die of this, ma'am." "My name," she said, "is Cordelia. My father called me Delia." He paused with his hand on the last knot. "Delia," he said. He said it the way a man who did not use many words might taste a new one, to see if he liked the shape of it in his mouth. "Delia, then. You will not die of this, Delia. You are in the Calloway cabin now. Nothing in this valley comes through that door unless we want it to." He tied off the linen. She slept that night in a bed piled 3 deep with gray wolf pelts and patchwork quilts sewn by a woman named Martha, whose name she did not yet know. She slept with the bedroom door unbolted. She had not slept with any door unbolted since Boston. She woke once in the deep, small hours and lay listening to the cabin. She heard the low murmur of the 3 brothers' voices in the main room, the occasional crack of the fire, the long, patient breathing of a house built to hold out winter. She heard Silas Calloway say low, "He will come for her." And she heard Amos say, "Let him come. Let him come up the mountain." And she heard Wyatt's softest of the 3 say she did not ask to be safe. She ought to be anyway. She slept again, and this time she slept without dreams. The first week passed like a held breath. She healed in small increments. The swelling around her eye went down on the 3rd day. The split at her lip closed. The bruise along her jaw turned from purple to the color of a ripe plum and then began to yellow at the edges. Her ribs still caught when she laughed, so she tried not to laugh, which meant Amos Calloway redoubled his efforts to make her laugh because Amos had decided within 48 hours of her arrival That her laugh was a sound the cabin had been missing for 10 years, and he intended to hear it as often as he could arrange. She found Martha's apron on a peg by the stove on the second morning. Silas told her in 3 words, "Martha, my wife." She passed. She did not ask more. She tied the apron on, and she began slowly to learn the cabin. Wyatt taught her to work the Dutch oven. He taught her to bank a fire so it would hold through the night and still have coals by morning. He showed her the clever iron arm that swung the coffee pot over the flame. He showed her the sourdough starter, which he called Lazarus, because he said the jar had died twice in 10 years, and both times he had raised it up again with flour and patience. Amos took her out on the third morning, wrapped in Wyatt's extra bearskin coat, and a pair of wool trousers rolled 4 times at the ankle, and showed her the stock. The 3-pack mules, Millie Ruth and Hannah. The saddle horses, Silas's Appaloosa called Sergeant and his own roan called Dusty. The milk goat Patience, who looked at Cordelia with the aggrieved expression of a dowager interrupted at tea. The hen house where a battered red rooster ruled 6 hens with the air of a small Napoleon. Amos showed her the smokehouse. The rack of hanging venison wrapped in cheesecloth. The deep stone-lined spring house where cream set in crocks and butter kept sweet in summer. The woodshed stacked so neatly she thought of a library. He showed her the hide store where Castor trapped that autumn hung dark and glossy on wooden stretchers, and where a single gray wolf pelt taken the previous winter was spread on the far wall. He did not show it off. He mentioned in passing that Wyatt had cried when the wolf came to the bait, and that Silas had cried a little too afterward because the wolf had been very old and very hungry, and Silas had made the shot clean out of respect. She understood by the end of that third day that these were not the kind of mountain men the penny novels in Boston had invented. On the 4th morning, Silas brought out the Schofield. He sat her at the kitchen table and laid the revolver on a folded flour sack between them. Smith and Wesson. Nickel-plated, the top break action gleamed like a new coin. He laid out 6 cartridges beside it in a neat row. "You need to know how to use this," he said. "Not because I expect the worst, because I expect the world. Women who cannot defend themselves in this country are at the mercy of men who do not deserve to share the road with them. You will not be such a woman, Delia, not under this roof." He showed her the action. He showed her how to break the revolver open with her thumb, and how to thumb the spent cases out, and how to load fresh rounds without looking at her hands. He made her practice an hour empty, then another hour empty. Then on the morning of the 5th day, he took her out past the woodshed and set up 3 tin cans on a stump 40 paces off, and he stood behind her, and without touching her, he spoke her through the grip, the stance, the breath. "Elbow down, Delia. Don't lock it. Shoulder soft. Breathe out, then squeeze. Don't pull." When the first can jumped off the stump, she let out a breath she had not known she was holding and turned toward him, wide-eyed, a smile breaking across her face such as he had not seen on any woman since Martha. He looked at her, it beat too long. He cleared his throat and pointed back at the stump. "2 more cans, ma'am." That night she saw him at the hearth with Martha's scarf. She had padded out of her bedroom in Wyatt's borrowed flannel shirt and a pair of thick wool socks to fetch a drink of water. The main room was dim. The fire had burned down to red embers. Amos and Wyatt were asleep, rolled in their blankets across the far end of the room. She had not meant to see anything. She had only meant to move quietly. Silas Calloway was sitting in the pine chair she had sat in her first night. He was cleaning a small silver-plated hunting knife with a scrap of wool. Across his knee, toothed flat by one enormous scarred hand, was a pale blue silk scarf, a woman's scarf frayed at one corner, the color of forget-me-nots. He was not weeping. His face was stone calm. But he lifted the scarf to his face once, and he pressed it gently against the side of his nose, and he closed his eyes for the span of 3 long breaths. Cordelia stepped back into her doorway without a sound. She stood there a moment, then she closed the door. She did not sleep for a long while. In the morning, she was up before any of them. She built the fire the way Wyatt had shown her. She set the coffee. She mixed sourdough biscuits and slid them into the Dutch oven. She found in the spring house a small crock of wild honey Wyatt had robbed from a bee tree in September. She set the table for four. She found a late sprig of rosemary in the dried herb bunch, and she laid a single stem across Silas Calloway's plate. When he came out of the workshop at dawn with sawdust in his beard, he stopped in the doorway and looked at the table for a long moment. Morning, she said. It came out steady. She was proud of that. Morning, he said. He sat. He picked up the rosemary. He turned it in his fingers. He did not look at her. After a moment, he laid it carefully in his shirt pocket over his heart. I am sorry, she said quietly, so that the brothers in the main room would not hear. About your Martha. He did not look up. Thank you, Delia, he said. And that was all that passed between them. But it was enough, and Wyatt, coming in from the hen house with 6 eggs in the fold of his shirt, saw his eldest brother's face as he lifted that first cup of coffee, and he said nothing, but he smiled all the way down to his boots. On the 7th morning, Amos Calloway decided it was time to teach her to ride astride. She had sat a side saddle in Boston parks with a riding master at her elbow. She had never sat a man's saddle in her life. Amos said that a woman on a mountain needed to ride like a mountain woman, and so he brought Dusty the roan out of the stable, and he boosted her up before she had quite finished objecting, and he led her twice around the home pasture at a walk, explaining the reins, the balance, the heels. On the 3rd circuit, Dusty, who had not been ridden by anyone but Amos in 2 years, decided he had had enough of the gentle lady with the light hands, and he put his nose down and humped his back once in a small exploratory way. Cordelia slid off sideways with the grace of a sack of potatoes. She landed in a pile of fresh stable muck behind the chicken house. There was a terrible silence. Amos opened his mouth. He closed it. He began to laugh. It was not a polite laugh. It was a laugh that started somewhere in his boots and came up through his whole body, and it doubled him over. One hand braced on Dusty's withers, the other wiping at his eyes. Wyatt, emerging from the woodshed with an armload of kindling, saw her sitting there in the muck, with her hair full of straw, and a look of deep personal offense on her face, and Wyatt, who almost never laughed, dropped the kindling and laughed so hard he had to sit down on the chopping block. And Cordelia, Ashby Boston girl, 3 months a widow of a marriage she had never consummated, bruised and aching, and strawed in stable muck, looked up at the 2 Calloway brothers, laughing helpless in the morning sun, and she began to laugh too. She laughed until her broken ribs sang. She laughed until she had to press her forearm across her middle to hold herself together. She laughed until tears ran down her dirty face, and she hiccuped, and she laughed again. Silas Calloway came around the corner of the cabin with a bucket of milk in one hand. He stopped. He stood very still and watched his 2 brothers and the small woman, sitting in muck in the sun, all 3 of them laughing, and something in his face did a slow, careful thing Cordelia did not see, and his brothers did. He smiled. He smiled. He had not smiled in 10 years. Amos caught it from the corner of his eye. Amos's laugh cut off. He nudged Wyatt with his knee. Wyatt looked up. The 2 Calloway brothers watched their eldest brother smile in the morning sun with a bucket of milk in his hand, and Amos said very quietly for Wyatt's ear, "Only I will be damned." The 2nd week they settled into the rhythm. Cordelia found to her own astonishment that she was useful. She was no drawing room flower. She had grown up a merchant's daughter in a house of thrift and industry, and once she understood the layout of the cabin and the schedule of the day, she began to move through the work with a quiet competence that surprised her and pleased. Although he never said so, Silas Calloway. She learned to milk Patience the goat. She learned to skim cream. She learned to render tallow for soap, and one long afternoon with Wyatt, standing beside her, patiently measuring lie by eye, she made her first bar. It was lumpy. It smelled faintly of rosemary because she had thrown a sprig into the mixture. Wyatt cut it into 4 rough cakes and stacked it on the shelf next to the lavender soap his mother had made 20 years ago in Tennessee, and he said, "That is a Calloway soap. That gets stamped and dated." And he took a piece of charcoal and wrote on the cake D.A. October 1879 in his careful draftsman's hand. She read Shakespeare aloud by firelight on 3 successive evenings. Silas asked for As You Like It. Amos, to everyone's astonishment, asked for the porter scene from Macbeth. Wyatt asked for sonnets. She read the 18th sonnet, and she got to the line, Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. And Silas Calloway set down the awl he was working with, and he looked into the fire for a long moment before he asked her very gently to go on. On the 10th evening, Wyatt played his mouth harp by the fire. It was a silver-tongued harmonica, well-worn, the kind a man carried in his shirt pocket for 20 years. He played Shenandoah first slow, the way a man plays a song he loves and is a little afraid of. He played the parting glass. He played at Amos's request Lorena. Then he played Amazing Grace. Cordelia, who was sitting in her chair mending a tear in Amos's wool shirt, laid the mending on her knee. The mountain outside the cabin was a great silent presence, snow falling on snow. The fire cracked. The silver notes of Wyatt Calloway's harmonica moved in the small room the way a hand moves across the surface of a still pond. She looked at Silas across the fire from her. He was watching the flames, but his eyes were not hard. His eyes were the eyes of a man hearing music he had not expected to hear in this world again. She looked down at her mending. She understood somewhere in that song that she was falling in love with him. She did not know what to do with that understanding. She was 23 years old, and she had crossed 2,000 miles for a lie, and she had been beaten into the dirt of a muddy frontier street, and she was still technically by the false ledger in the assayer's office in Oak Haven, the wife of Thaddeus Crowe. She had no right to this feeling, and yet it came as real as the cracked rib under the linen binding, as real as the firelight on the honest worn boots of the man across from her. She folded the mending. She excused herself. She went to her bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark a long while. And in the main room, Silas Calloway, who had watched her face in the harmonica light from beneath his lowered brows, laid his hand on his brother Wyatt's shoulder for one long moment as he passed behind him and Wyatt, who had been a boy of 20 when Martha died, and a man of 30, now understood the hand and did not look up. On the morning of the 12th day, Wyatt carved her a comb. It was black walnut, the wood pulled from a downed limb of a tree his father had planted in Tennessee before the war. He had been working on it in the evenings after she went to bed, shaping the teeth with a thin-bladed whittling knife and polishing the back with the smooth stone he used for knife work. When he set it on the kitchen table beside her plate at breakfast, he did not make a speech. He only said, "Your hair is too good for that rawhide thong, ma'am. This will be gentler." She held it in her hand. The back was carved with a small thistle, a Calloway mark, the same one burned into the iron strap hinge of the cabin door. She had no words. She kissed Wyatt Calloway on his cheek quickly, the way a sister might. His ears went red, and he fled out the door with his coffee still in his hand. On the 14th morning, Amos came in from checking the snare line with an armful of frost-cured Indian paintbrush, the late ones that hid in the sheltered south-facing cuts where the wind did not strip them. The stems were stiff and gray, but the bracts were still as red as blood. He laid the bunch in a tin cup of water on the kitchen table without speaking, and he went to warm his hands at the stove. "Amos," she said. "The flowers. It is cold in here," he said to the stove. "Man needs coffee." On the 15th evening, Silas Calloway brought her a book. She had been reading her mother's Bible by firelight, and the old leather binding had finally given up. 2 sewn signatures had come loose. She had not shown anyone. That afternoon, while she was out feeding patients, Silas had taken the Bible down from her bedside table. He had spent most of the night on it. Waxed thread, fresh linen for a new spine lining, bear tallow rubbed into the old leather to soften it and bring the color back. A tiny strip of new kid leather sewn along the hinge where the old one had cracked. He did not make a ceremony. He walked to her chair where she was drinking tea, and he set the Bible on the arm of the chair beside her. "Fixed it," he said. "Not a fine job. Holds now." She opened it. The pages were her mother's pages. The round, girlish hand was her mother's hand. But the binding was new, and where there had been tear and loose stitching, there was now the quiet, neat work of a man who mended his own harness. "A man keeps his word," Silas said. He said it plain, not to her particularly, almost to himself. He was looking at the fire. You promised your mother you would keep that book all your life, I expect. A woman keeps her word, too. Her throat closed. Thank you, she said. It came out hoarse. He nodded once. He moved away to his chair. He did not look back at her. She sat holding her mended Bible with both hands, a long while, the fire spitting small red shards up the chimney, and she understood that somewhere in the last 15 days her life had turned. She did not know in which direction. She only knew it had turned. That night, after Amos and Wyatt had gone to their blankets, she stayed up. Silas stayed up too. The fire had burned down low. Snow fell hard outside. The wind was rising and the cabin creaked in its joints the way a well-built ship creaks in a heavy sea. She told him about her father, about folding telegrams at a breakfast table, about the heart that simply stopped, about the note from Percival Sterling with 3 lines on it and no signature, about Aunt Henrietta in the camphor-smelling third-floor bedroom and the word burden. He listened. Then he told her in the slow, rationed way he had about Vicksburg. He had been 22 years old when they put a Sharps rifle in his hands and told him he had the best eye in the company. He told her about a boy in gray on a parapet at dawn, a farm boy maybe 16, and a mother who was told 3 weeks later in a Louisiana kitchen by an officer holding a hat in his hands. He told her about coming home to Tennessee after Appomattox and finding his own mother in a grave and his father slowly dying and his 2 younger brothers half wild and 20 and 16. He told her about meeting Martha in a flower store in St. Louis in the spring of '66 and how she had been the first person who had ever looked at him without seeing a killer. He told her about cholera in the winter of '69. He told her about the locked door in Lafayette Square and the coachman in the rain. I buried her on a Tuesday, he said. I sat by her grave 3 days. Amos was 24. Wyatt was 20. They came and they got me. They put me on a horse. We came west. I did not think, he said, that there was any of me left that could feel anything again. I did not want there to be. He stopped. He pushed a piece of coal back with the toe of his boot. I was wrong about that, he said quietly. She reached across the space between their chairs. She laid her hand on his hand where it rested on the arm of his chair. He did not pull away. He did not turn his hand over to take hers. He only very slowly let out the breath he had been holding for 10 years. They sat like that for a long time. The fire burned low. Snow hissed against the window glass. Somewhere high above the cabin, on a shoulder of the mountain, a great horned owl called once long and low. You are a good woman, Delia Silas Calloway said at last. The mountain knew what it was doing. She did not answer. She did not need to. They stayed like that, her small hand covering his large scarred one, until the fire was only embers, and the clock on the mantel ticked past midnight, and Silas very gently said, You need to sleep, darling. You are still healing. She went to her bedroom. She did not bar the door. She lay in the bed of wolf pelts and quilts, and she stared at the rough timber ceiling, and she thought, I have been here 2 weeks. Only 2 weeks. How can it be that this room feels more like mine than any room I have ever slept in? She slept. What she did not know, what Silas did not know, what the mountain in its snowing silence could not warn them of. 20 miles down the valley, in the front parlor of the Silver Keg Saloon, with a fire banked low and a curtain drawn, Thaddeus Crow was at that precise moment counting out $200 in gold coin onto a felt-top table. Across from him sat 2 men. One was a heavy red-faced man with a bowie knife on his belt and eyes the color of muddy ice. The other was his brother, taller, thinner, with a long-jawed, handsome face, ruined by a thin white scar that ran from his right ear to the corner of his mouth. Their name was Brannon. They had ridden in from Missouri at dusk. There is an extra 50, Crow was sinting, his voice tight, if the mountain man dies slow. He has caused me considerable offense. Cletus Brannon picked up a gold piece and bit it by old habit. Mister, he said, for 200 we will make him die any way you like. In the doorway of the back room, unseen, a thin shadow shifted. Bess Finley, carrying a tray of empty whiskey glasses, had paused with her hand on the knob. She stood very still. She listened until Crow named the trail. She listened until he described the cabin. She listened until Boy Brannon said, "We ride at first light," and Crow said, "Good." Then Bess Finley, quiet as a barn cat, set the tray down on a side table, slipped through the kitchen, and climbed the back stairs. Under the loose floorboard in her room were 4 letters. Beside them was a small oiled pouch of silver coins she had been saving for 3 years toward a train ticket east. Beside the coins was a man's folded cotton shirt she had found in the bottom of a barrel in the stables and altered for herself. Beside the shirt was a Colt pocket revolver with 3 rounds in the cylinder that had belonged to a miner who had tipped her generous one Christmas and been killed over a faro game the following night. Bess Finley looked at the little pile. She looked at the small window beyond which the first fat flakes of a new storm were beginning to fall on Oak Haven. She began calmly to pack. And high up on the mountain in a cabin made warm against the coming storm, Cordelia Ashby turned in her sleep and for the first time in her life smiled in her dreams. The storm broke before dawn. Cordelia woke to the wind. It had a voice on this mountain, not the thin, polite wind of a Boston harbor. A deep-throated wind that came down off the ridges with the weight of a freight engine and shook the cabin in its stone foundations and made the shutters groan against their iron hasps. She lay in the dark under the wolf pelts, and she listened. She heard the fire crackle in the next room. She heard the low murmur of the 3 brothers' voices already awake, already at the table. She heard the clink of a coffee cup. She rose. She dressed in the flannel shirt and a pair of Wyatt's old wool trousers rolled 4 times at the ankle in the thick knitted socks Amos had given her 2 days before. She opened her bedroom door. Silas Calloway was at the head of the table. A lantern hung low over him. In front of him lay his Sharps buffalo rifle broken down to its barrel, and stock a tin of oil beside it. On his left hand, already loaded, stood his Winchester 73. Across from him, Amos was threading a leather bandolier with brass cartridges. Wyatt at the far end of the table was filling a pouch with what looked to her untrained eye like small tin cylinders capped with wax. They looked up when she came in. None of them smiled. Delia, Silas said. His voice was low and steady and carried no fear in it and no surprise. "Sit. Wyatt has coffee." She sat. Wyatt pushed a tin cup toward her. He did not meet her eyes. "What is it?" she said. Amos reached across the table without a word. He turned over a scrap of paper in front of her. A rough sketch in charcoal. 4 horses, 4 riders, military saddles, coming up the switchback. "Saw the sign at 4 this morning," Amos said. "Rode down to the second overlook and glassed them at dawn from behind the blue spruce deadfall. 2 of them are the Brannon brothers out of Independence, Missouri. The other 2 are hired guns I do not know by name, but I know the work. They are professional. They will not come straight. They will split once they hit the tree line and come at this cabin from 3 sides. Cordelia's hand had gone cold around the tin cup. "You did not wake me." "Nothing for you to do while the coffee was brewing," Silas said. She looked from one face to the other. "How far out?" she said. 3 hours, Amos said. 2 if they push the horses, the Schofield, Silas said. He slid the nickel-plated revolver across the table toward her. A small cloth bag of cartridges beside it. "You keep this on you. You do not set it down. You do not lay it on a chair. You do not hang it on a peg. It lives on your body until I tell you different. You understand me, Delia." She nodded. She buckled the belt he handed her over her flannel shirt. The weight of the pistol on her hip was strange and intimate, the way a key to a new house is strange and intimate. "Now," Silas said, "you are going to do 3 things for me. You are going to eat this breakfast Wyatt cooked because you will not fight while hungry. You are going to go out to the spring house with Amos, and you are going to fill every water jug we have got and bring them inside. And you are going to take the trapdoor rug up off the main room floor, and you are going to set it against the wall by your bedroom door so it is out of the way when we need to go through." She ate. She had not thought she could. The biscuits were hot and buttered, and the coffee was Wyatt's best, and she ate because Silas Calloway had told her to, And because she understood without being told again that the small woman who had knelt in the mud of Oak Haven 2 weeks ago was going to be of no use in the next 3 hours. Another woman would have to stand up in her place. That woman she suspected had been inside her all along. She stood up. She went with Amos to the spring house. The wind nearly took her off her feet on the path. She held onto his elbow. They filled 4 stoneware jugs. She carried 2 of them back. Amos took the other 2 in one heavy stone crock of lard, besides without strain, as if they weighed nothing. In the cabin, she pulled up the thick woven rug from the floor in front of the fireplace, and she saw for the first time the heavy wooden trap door set flush into the floor planks, its iron ring recessed so a boot would not catch it. Wyatt was at the front window. He had knocked out a small rectangle of wood from the lower frame, the kind of removable block she now understood had been cut to exactly the width of a rifle barrel 10 years ago when the cabin was built. 2 more such ports, she realized, were built into the rear and side walls. This cabin had not been designed to be a home only. It had been designed to hold a siege. Silas came to her. He set his hands on her shoulders lightly. "Delia," he said, "listen to me. When it starts, you go under that table. Right there. The table is made of oak timbers 3 inches thick. You can sit up under it. You keep the Schofield drawn, and you keep your eye on the trap door, and you keep your eye on the back door. If a man comes through that back door who is not one of us, you put 2 rounds in him center mass. 2, not 1. You understand me?" "2," she said. 2, and if you hear me yell the word ground, you drop flat. You do not look up. You do not look for me. You drop. You understand me?" "I understand." He looked at her a moment longer. His eyes in the gray storm light were the color of old whiskey with a low fire behind it. He did not say whatever he was thinking of saying. He nodded once small, and he let go of her shoulders. "Wyatt," he said without turning, "give her the other thing." Wyatt crossed to the workbench. He came back with a small cloth bundle tied with twine. He set it in her hands. "What is it?" she said. "Open it if this goes wrong," Wyatt said, quietly. She slipped it into the pocket of the heavy canvas coat Amos had lent her. She did not open it. The first shot came 40 minutes later. She was drawing water from the reserve kettle at the stove. The rifle crack sounded flat and small in the wind, a single sharp clap like a hand slapped on a tabletop. Then glass. The kitchen window above the dry sink disintegrated into a shower of bright splinters. A piece of lead as long as her thumb buried itself in the log wall 3 feet from her head. She did not scream. She moved. She was under the oak table before the second round came. Silas was at the front firing port. She watched his boots. She watched the long barrel of the sharp slide into the slot. She saw the stock lift against his shoulder. She watched his whole body settle. The sharp spoke. It was not a sound like a rifle. It was a sound like a door slamming in hell. The whole cabin jumped. Out in the clearing, a horse screamed. A man shouted. "That is one," Silas said quietly. His voice had not changed tone since she had known him. "Reload." Amos was at the side port Winchester at his shoulder, firing fast, disciplined bursts, 3 shots, then pause, 3 shots, then pause. Wyatt was at the rear, his shotgun broken over his arm, then snapped shut. A boom, a reload, a boom. A muzzle flash bloomed at the edge of the tree line, and a slug punched through a chinked gap beside Silas's head, kicking a puff of clay and horsehair into the room. He did not flinch. He shifted 2 inches, seated another .45-70 cartridge, and fired again. A second scream from outside. A second man went down. Then she heard it. A sound she did not have a name for at first. A soft thud above them on the roof, then another, then a thin hissing. Silas's head came up. "Dynamite," he said. "Ground." She flattened. She pressed her cheek against the plank floor. The smell of old lye soap and boot dust filled her nose. Silas was already moving. He covered the distance from the firing port to the fireplace in 4 strides, bent, ripped up the iron ring of the trap door, flung it open with a crash. Amos was across the room in 3 strides. Wyatt abandoned his shotgun, grabbed the strap of his spare powder pouch, and was down the trapdoor stairs like a cat down a well. Amos caught Cordelia under the arms, lifted her bodily from the floor, and was half through the trap door with her when the roof came off the cabin. The noise was white. There was no other word. Her ears went. The world went silent in the way it does when the sound is larger than sound. She felt more than heard the concussion. She felt Amos's body fold around hers, his shoulders shielding her head as a beam of burning roof timber came down across the table they had just been crouched beneath and split it in two. She felt Silas behind them, and then Silas was ahead of them, and then Silas was pulling her by the wrist down into the root cellar as a wave of heat rolled through the trapdoor opening and singed the hair at the back of her neck. Silas slammed the trapdoor shut above them. The cabin above their heads burned. They did not stop. The root cellar ran 30 feet to a narrow, reinforced tunnel Wyatt had spent 3 winters digging, shoring as he went with oak timbers. It came out behind the ridge in a blind ravine Amos had scouted when he was 19 and never forgotten. They went through the tunnel bent double. Wyatt first with a candle lantern, Cordelia second with Amos's hand locked around hers, Silas last with his Winchester dragging, and his left arm tucked against his body. They came out into snow. It was mid-morning. The storm had thickened. The ravine was a white slot between walls of gray granite. Smoke rose above the ridge behind them. 10 years of Callaway labor was burning into the sky. Silas leaned a moment against the rock wall. His face was the color of wax. A dark stain was spreading across the left shoulder of his bearskin coat. "Silas," she said, "I am fine. You are not." "Not now, Delia. Move." He pushed off the wall. He moved. He was already counting paces in his head. Wyatt was already ahead, breaking trail through calf-deep powder. Amos was already looking back, Winchester raised, guarding their tail. The old Widowmaker claim was a quarter-mile up the ravine. They reached it by the strength of something in Silas that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with the kind of man he was. The rotted timbers framed the black mouth like the ribs of a dead thing. A rusted sign hung sideways. "Callaway Silver Keep Out." Wyatt pulled aside a screen of frozen briar he had woven into the opening 2 years before as camouflage. He struck a match. He lit a brass lantern from the cache he kept just inside the entrance. They went in. It was a held breath of a mine. 5 miles of wandering black gut inside a mountain. Water drip, cold stone, sour iron on the air. Old timber props that groaned softly when the mountain shifted in its sleep. Wyatt closed the briar screen behind them from the inside. 50 feet into the dark, Silas sank to one knee. Cordelia was on her knees beside him before his hand touched stone. She peeled back the bare skin coat. The wool shirt beneath was black with blood from shoulder to elbow. "A beam," Amos said, kneeling on his other side, "a falling beam, took him across the shoulder when the roof came. He did not tell us." "I did not want to stop," Silas said. "You stupid, beautiful, stubborn Tennessee mule," Amos breathed. Cordelia was already ripping linen from the hem of her undershift. Her hands did not shake. She did not know why. Some calm place inside her had taken charge of her fingers. She cut the shirt back with Wyatt's boot knife. She examined the wound. It was deep. It was ugly. The collarbone was not broken. The artery was not cut. It was meat, only meat, but he had lost a great deal of blood and was losing more. "Whiskey," she said without looking up. Wyatt had a flat steel flask out of his coat before she finished the word. She poured it into the wound. Silas Callaway set his jaw. He did not make a sound. A single drop of sweat ran down the bridge of his nose and fell into his beard. She bound him tight with a strip of her underskirt. She drew the ends together. She tied them off with a knot her father had taught her on a sailboat in Buzzards Bay when she was 11 years old. She did not know where the knot had come from. She had not thought of it in 15 years. Her hands had simply remembered. "There," she said, her voice coming out level. "That will hold for now." Silas looked at her. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He closed his hand over hers briefly tight, and then he let go. It was at that moment that the screen of briar at the mine entrance rustled. Wyatt snuffed the lantern. The darkness was total, a blackness so complete it pressed on the eyes. Cordelia felt Amos's hand settle on her shoulder, warm and steadying. She heard the soft metallic click of Silas thumbing back the hammer of his Colt against his good thigh. And she heard from the mine entrance a woman's voice. "Don't shoot," the voice said. "It is me. It is Bess." Wyatt struck a match. In the flare of it, standing just inside the briar with snow melting in her wild red hair, was Bess Finley. She wore a man's canvas coat, 3 sizes too large, and men's wool trousers, and she held a carpet bag in one hand and a small nickel-plated pocket revolver in the other. Her face was chapped red from the wind and wet from melted snow. Her eyes under the coat's brim were very bright. Under her coat, tight against her body, she carried an oiled canvas pouch. "Oh, for the love of God," Amos said softly. It came out almost a prayer. Cordelia made a sound she did not recognize. She crossed the mine floor in 3 strides, and she gathered Bess Finley into her arms, and she held her hard against her own broken ribs. Bess stood stiff a moment, like a woman who had forgotten how to be held, and then she folded in against Cordelia, and she pressed her face into Cordelia's shoulder, and she shook once, a silent convulsion, and then she stood up straight and wiped her face with the back of her wrist. "I stole his letters," Bess said. "All 4 of them. Judge Moses Howlett in Denver, 2 territorial land officers. He has bought and sold Delia. Crow is bought and sold. He has been for years." She pressed the oil pouch into Cordelia's hands. "I could not wait," Bess said. "He sent the Brannon brothers up the mountain this morning, and I heard him naming your trail to them in his back parlor, and I heard them take his 200 in gold. And I could not wait. I rode up the east shoulder behind Henderson's dun pony. He won at Faro last year, and I saw the cabin burning from 3 miles out, and I came in. I came." "You came," Cordelia said. "I came," Bess said. Wyatt Calloway, who had been holding the match, had been staring at Bess Finley for the full 7 seconds it had burned. When the match winked out and he fumbled another from his tin, and the second match flared his face, Cordelia saw was doing something it had not done for her, something it had not done for anyone in 10 years. It was looking at a stranger as if the stranger were not a stranger at all, but a person the world had been keeping in reserve for him. He said nothing. He swallowed. He shrugged out of his bearskin coat without a word, and he laid it across Bess Finley's shoulders. The coat swallowed her to the ankles. She looked up at him in the matchlight, startled, and Wyatt Calloway, the quiet one, the youngest, the one who had never in his life courted any woman, only dipped his chin, the smallest fraction, and said, "You'll freeze, ma'am." Bess blinked. "I'm obliged," she said. Amos, who missed absolutely nothing in this life, filed all of it away behind his teeth for later torment. They moved deeper into the mine. The plan, as Amos and Wyatt worked it out between them in low voices, while Cordelia redressed Silas's shoulder with Bess's help, was simple and terrible. Boyd Brannon was still alive. They had heard no word from Cletus or the 2 hired guns they had put down in the firefight at the cabin, but the Brannons were brothers, and Boyd would not leave his brother's body in the snow without accounting for it. He would follow them into the mine. He would have to. And a man following through 5 miles of lantern black with no knowledge of the tunnels was a man Amos Calloway could hunt. "The 4 of you go," Amos said. "I will hold the crossing at the second drift. Wyatt, you take them east and up. The Dutchman's ventilation shaft on the east face, straight out onto the ridge. Circle wide south to Silver Cliff." "You are not staying alone," Silas said. "Brother," Amos met his eldest brother's eye in the lantern light, and his voice was very soft and very steady. "Since the day Mama died, you have carried everything. You carried Daddy when the drink took him. You carried me and Wyatt out of Tennessee. You carried Martha to her grave. You have been carrying for 19 years. Today you let me carry. Do you hear me?" Silas looked at him. Something in his face worked. "All right," he said. Amos grinned. The old light, wild and boyish, came back into his face. "You tell me when you make the ridge," he said. "You fire 2 shots spaced. I will come." Bess Finley stepped in front of Amos. She was small against him. Her hair was still wet with snow. She had to tilt her face up to see him. "Calloway," she said. It came out low and hoarse and not at all steady. "You stay alive. You hear me? I have not said half of what I want to say to you." Amos looked down at this muddy, half-frozen, red-haired woman from a saloon in Oak Haven, and he did something Cordelia had not seen Amos Calloway do in 2 weeks of sharing a cabin with him. He went still. Then he bent his head, and he brushed the very tip of his nose once against her forehead. It was not a kiss. It was somehow more private than a kiss. It was a promise. "You say it when I come find you," he said. He melted backward into the dark drift. The lantern Wyatt held showed his buckskin shoulders disappearing, and then his boots, and then he was gone. Wyatt took point. Silas fell in second, his right arm still strong, his left sling tight against his body, his Winchester in his right hand. Cordelia took the middle, Bess behind her. They moved. Wyatt Calloway knew the Widowmaker the way other men knew their own kitchens. He had been down it in every season of his 20s. He knew which timber props were sound and which whispered when the mountain breathed. He knew which drifts bled water and which were dry. He knew the 3 crosscuts where the air was bad and they should hold their breath and move fast. He knew the blind shaft at the 1,000-foot level with a 40-foot drop and no rail. He led them past it with one palm pressed flat to the wall and his lantern turned low. Halfway through, where 2 drifts met and the roof sagged with rot, they heard it. 3 soft claps of sound, distant, muffled. They rolled through the rock like something moving in the belly of a whale. "Pistol shots," Silas said. Cordelia felt the blood leave her face. Wyatt held the lantern up. He listened. His head was cocked like a dog listening at a door. "3 shots spaced," he said, very low. "That is the Amos signal. 3 means hit and still on his feet." 3 came back, Silas said. "Go." They went. They had gone perhaps another quarter-mile when the second sound came. This one was not a pistol. It was a long, low, grinding rumble, the voice of timber props giving way under weight, and under it a single hollow scream. The scream lasted perhaps a second. It stopped. Cordelia reached back and gripped Bess Finley's wrist. Bess gripped it back hard enough to grind the bones in Cordelia's hand. A minute later, in the far dark behind them, they heard a man walking. Uneven, favoring a leg, whistling low and tuneless, a bar and a half of Lorena. "Hold," Wyatt said. He hooded the lantern entirely. They stood pressed against the cold stone wall of the drift. The whistling got closer. Amos Calloway limped out of the drift into the lamp. Wyatt let out of the hood in a single slow slide of his thumb. One hand was pressed to his left thigh. Blood was soaking the canvas of his trousers above the knee and running into his boot. His face was gray. His grin was feral. "Boyd Brannon and 2 boys he brought with him," he said through his teeth, "are not coming out of the East Drift today. I cut the retaining chains on a loaded ore cart. 1,000-pound of high grade. It did the work." "You took a bullet," Silas said. Flesh Amos said. "Went clean. I am walking, ain't I?" Bess Finley moved to him. She did not speak. She slid her small arm under his shoulder on his wounded side. Her head barely came to his collarbone. She took his weight without flinching. "Lean," she said. He leaned. They moved. The drift changed character after another 100 yards. The air grew cleaner, colder. There was a faint drift of wood smoke on it that did not belong to this mine. Wyatt's steps slowed. "We are near the back shaft," he whispered. "Something is off." The drift elbowed right and opened. Cordelia had never seen a room inside a mountain. She had imagined mines as tunnels and only tunnels. What lay beyond Wyatt Calloway's hooded lantern was a chamber the size of a cathedral nave. 4 lanterns burned on iron hooks around the walls. Stacks of wooden crates stood 10 high along 3 sides stamped in black, across her slats with the letters TC. In the center of the chamber, heavy canvas tarps had been thrown back from a mound of raw, pale gray ore. A ventilated assayer's kiln sat against one wall beside a crude smelting crucible. A pair of smoke-stained iron ingots, each the length of a man's forearm, rested on a trestle bench. Silver, pure silver in bars, millions of dollars of silver. And standing at the far end of the chamber in a long wool duster that brushed the floor, a double-barreled 10-gauge broken over his arm like a walking stick stood Dutch Vandermeer. Behind him, rifles leveled, stood four miners. Dutch smiled. He had a flat, wide smile like a river flood. No warmth in it at all. "Well," he said, "what have we here?" Silas laid his Winchester on the floor without being told. He straightened slowly, holding his wounded arm against his body, and he stepped in front of Cordelia and Bess, and he did not take his eyes off Dutch Vandermeer. "Drop the iron, Calloway," Dutch said, "and the little lady is going to hand me a certain book of accounts that was lifted from my employer's desk. Nice and slow." He raised the 10-gauge and leveled both barrels at Silas's chest. Silas did not move. Cordelia Ashby, standing behind him, standing with Bess, Finley's hand clenched around her own, and with the weight of the Schofield hanging warm against her hip, looked past Silas's shoulder at Dutch Vandermeer's flat river flood smile. And she looked past Dutch at the stack of crates along the chamber's east wall. And she saw clearly in the lantern light the stenciled word DuPont on four of those crates, along with the smaller word below it she had seen in her father's own shipyard warehouses as a girl. Blasting powder, 20 yards away. Her eyes went to Wyatt. Wyatt, she realized, was already looking at the crates. He had already done the mathematics. His eyes came back to hers, and he tilted his chin a quarter of an inch, and the question was in his face. Could she? Yes, her eyes said. Yes, she could. "I have the ledger," she said to Dutch Vandermeer. Her voice came out steady. "I will bring it to you," she said. "Let me step around my husband." She said the word husband deliberately. She was watching the faces of the four miners behind Dutch. She saw two of them glance at each other at the word. Dutch's smile stretched a fraction. "Step around then, lady," he said. She stepped around Silas. Her hand went into the pocket of Amos's borrowed canvas coat. Her fingers closed on the small cloth bundle tied with twine that Wyatt Calloway had put into her hand at dawn. "Open it if this goes wrong," he had said. She walked 3 paces toward Dutch Vandermeer. She made the 4th paces deliberately clumsy. She stumbled slightly, she made a small sound of pain that was not entirely feigned, and the hand in her coat pocket came out not with the ledger at all, but with the small cloth bundle. She let it fall. It hit the stone floor between her feet, and it tumbled. She said clearly to Silas behind her ground. Then she dropped. Wyatt was moving before her knees hit the rock. He had a second match struck, and he had already flung it lit in a small, bright arc that landed square in the bed of the tumbled cloth bundle. Because in the bundle, she realized as she fell, Wyatt had put 3 of his small, wax-capped tin cylinders. Minor squibs, crude little noisemakers he had packed for emergencies, no more dangerous in themselves than oversized firecrackers. But the match hit. The squibs hissed. And Silas Calloway, who had been waiting for her word, seized the iron lantern hook from the wall beside him with his good right hand and sent the lit oil lantern hanging on it, spinning end over end 20 yards across the chamber, in a beautiful long arc that ended exactly in the stacked crates of DuPont blasting powder. Dutch Vandermeer shouted something that was lost. Amos tackled Bess. Wyatt tackled Cordelia. Silas hit the floor behind the nearest rusted iron ore cart and pulled it up onto its side in front of his own body with the last strength his right arm had in it. The world ended. The explosion was not a sound. It was an event. The shock rolled through the chamber, lifted the ore cart off its wheels, slammed it back down, and took out the lantern hooks and the canvas tarps and the assayer's kiln and the trestle with the ingots on it in a single white blow. A wave of hot wind and rock dust and flame rolled over the iron cart and moved on. On the far side of the chamber where Dutch Vandermeer and his 4 miners had been standing, a 30-foot section of the chamber's ceiling Let go. 80 tons of granite came down in a slow roar that seemed to last a year. The lanterns on the east wall went out one by one as they were buried. When the sound ended, the silence was the loudest thing Cordelia Ashby had ever heard. Wyatt was on top of her. He rolled off. She sat up. Her ears rang like struck iron. Her mouth was full of dust. Bess Finley was sitting on the floor beside Amos, her hand pressed to the side of his face as if to check that he was still there. Amos's face was black with powder. He spat blood. He grinned. That, he said hoarsely, is my wife. Silas was rising on one knee beside the overturned ore cart. His face was ashen. His left arm had begun to bleed again. But he was on his feet, and he was looking at her, and his eyes in the one surviving lantern's light were the eyes of a man who had just seen the woman he loved set off 80 tons of rock with a match and a handful of firecrackers to save all of their lives. Delia, he said. That was all. She walked to him on unsteady feet through the settling dust. She said the ventilation shaft, Wyatt. How far? 300 yards, Wyatt said. Up, straight up. Then we climb, she said. They climbed. It was a rotten wooden ladder bolted to the stone of a chimney shaft 150 feet tall. It had been set there in 1868 by a man long dead. 2 of its rungs had already given way in the 10 years since the Widowmaker had been abandoned. 3 more would give way before they reached the top. She went first. Wyatt had insisted. He said a woman of her size could test the rungs. If one broke, he said he was strong enough below her to catch her. She understood that if she broke through all the rungs at once, he would die with her. She climbed anyway. Bess came second. Wyatt's bearskin coat fastened tight around her. Amos came third. His left leg was dragging. He did not speak. He climbed on his arms. Silas came last. He climbed with one arm. His left hung useless at his side. Every rung was a small private agony. He did not stop, and he did not ask anyone to stop. Halfway up, a rung crumbled under Cordelia's boot. She dropped a foot. Wyatt's palm caught the small of her back flat against the cotton shirt he had loaned her 2 weeks ago. His voice below her very quiet. I have you. Keep climbing. She kept climbing. She pulled herself out of the shaft into wind and snow and a high, thin mountain dusk. The ridge when she sat back in the snow to wait for the others was bare and white. Below to the west, the valley was wrapped in cloud. Above to the east, a single star had found the gap in the storm. Bess came up behind her. Amos after, Wyatt after that. Silas nearly did not make the last rung. She saw his fingers appear on the lip. She saw them slip. She threw herself flat on the ice at the edge, and her hands closed around his wrist. Wyatt was beside her, so a heartbeat later, his own hand locking on Silas's shoulder. They pulled him up together. He rolled onto his back in the snow. His face was the color of bone. His left side was soaked black. His breath came shallow. She went to her knees beside him. She cradled his head in her lap, shielding his face from the wind with her own body. She peeled back the bearskin. The bandage she had tied in the mine was saturated. She tore the sleeve of her own flannel shirt off at the shoulder. She bound it over the old binding with hands that did not shake. She did not cremate. Some woman who lived inside her now and had not lived there 3 weeks ago was doing all this. Silas opened his eyes. Darling, he said. His voice was a whisper. Do not, she said. Do not you dare. He said. Not going to, just needed to see your face. She pressed her forehead to his. She tasted stone dust and blood and the salt of her own tears. I love you, Silas Calloway, she said. I love you. I have loved you since you put your hand down to me in the mud of Oak Haven. I do not know how it happened. I only know it is true. If you die now, I will never forgive you. Do you hear me? He smiled. It took what he had. Delia, he said, winter always ends, and I did not ride up that mountain path carrying you to die on a ridge without telling you what I have been telling myself for 10 days. I love you. The mountain chose you. For me. He turned his face. He kissed her palm where it lay against his jaw. It was gentle. It was brief. It was the first fade to dark. Behind them on the ridge, the three horses the Brannon brothers had left tethered in the blue spruce grove 2 hours and a lifetime ago, snorted at the smell of blood on the wind. Bess was already on her feet, untying them. Wyatt was already beside her, boosting her up onto the first saddle. Amos, leaning on a Winchester he had taken from the blown chamber below, was grinning through his blood. Silver Cliff, Phyllis whispered against her palm. Telegraph. Marshal Neagle in Denver. Pitkin the governor. End it, she agreed. And she lifted him, with Wyatt's help, onto the back of the gentlest of the three horses. And she mounted the second one astride in the last failing light, and the five of them turned east in the new night and started down the long trail out of the high country toward the lights of the Denver and Rio Grande Western rails at Silver Cliff, 20 miles and one last reckoning away. They rode through the night. The storm broke near midnight. The clouds tore open to the east, and a cold, hard moon came down on the high country and turned every snowfield into a plate of hammered silver. Amos rode point on a mouse-colored pony that had belonged to Boyd Brannon that morning. Wyatt rode drag. Bess rode beside Cordelia with the oiled pouch buttoned inside her coat against her skin. And Silas rode tied. Cordelia had done the tying. She had stripped the saddle blanket from the third horse, folded it against his chest, where the shoulder was worst, and then she had taken a length of rawhide out of Wyatt's saddlebag, and she had lashed her husband upright in the saddle by the waist, the way a father lashes a sleeping child to a pack horse on a long trail. He had protested. He had lost. He had fallen asleep with his chin on his breastbone within 10 minutes, and she had ridden knee to knee with him for 4 hours with one gloved hand resting flat on his thigh, so she would feel him sway before he tipped. The trail dropped. The pines thinned. A wind came up the valley that smelled of coal smoke and kerosene and something cooked at a railroad depot. At 3 in the morning, the lights of Silver Cliff rose up out of the dark like a small field of yellow stars. Silver Cliff was not Oak Haven. Silver Cliff was a proper incorporated town. Gas lamps along a planked main street. A Denver and Rio Grande spur that ran right up to a red-painted depot. A 2-story brick bank. A real sheriff paid by a real county. 3 churches. A boarding school for the children of 4 men. It had been built on a silver strike that had paid out honest and paid out long and honest money, had set a tone in the town that no amount of Oak Haven could have produced if it tried. The 5 of them came down Main Street at a walk. A lamp burned in the window of the Western Union office beside the depot. Cordelia slid from her horse. She caught Silas under the arms as Amos cut the rawhide. Together they took his weight. He could walk. He walked. He leaned on her shoulder and on Wyatt's shoulder, and between them he made the 20 paces to the door of the telegraph office, and Bess pushed it open ahead of them, and they came into lamplight and warmth and the smell of coffee and brass polish. The operator was a small man in green eye shades. His name, she would learn, was Horace Fenwick. He had been on the night shift of the Western Union office in Silver Cliff for 7 years. He had never in those 7 years had 5 strangers come through his door at 3 in the morning, covered in blood and rock dust. He put his coffee down very carefully. "Ma'am," he said. Cordelia laid the oiled pouch of letters on the counter. "Mr. Fenwick," she said, her voice coming out with a clarity that surprised even her. "I need to open a line to United States Marshal David Neagle in Denver. I need to open a second line to the office of Governor Frederick Walker Pitkin. My name is Cordelia Ashby. I have evidence of a multi-million-dollar silver fraud at the Widowmaker claim above Oak Haven, the systematic bribery of a federal judge named Moses Howlett, and the attempted murder this morning of 4 United States citizens, including myself, by hired gunmen from Missouri. I am going to sit in this chair. My friend Mr. Calloway is going to sit in that chair. You are going to send those 2 wires, and then you are going to send a 3rd wire to the nearest physician because my husband is bleeding out." She paused. "Please," she added, because her mother had raised her in Boston, and some things do not leave you. Horace Fenwick did not argue. He sent. His fingers moved over the brass key with a dry staccato click that filled the little wood-paneled room and made Amos, leaning in the doorway with a grin and a bullet hole through his trouser leg, mutter appreciatively that this fellow was wasted on the night shift. The replies came within 40 minutes. Marshal Nagel was already on a train. Governor Pickens' office sent in the governor's own clipped private cipher, which Fenwick read aloud in a voice of rising excitement the following. Full federal authority granted pending Marshal's arrival. Stop hold all parties. Stop hold all evidence. Stop Pitkin. Stop. By the time the telegraph machine stopped clicking, Dr. Ambrose Whitby of Silver Cliff, who had been hauled out of bed by a depot boy with $2 in a specific instruction, was already bending over Silas on a cot the operator had unfolded in the back room. Whitby was a short man with a gray mustache and the unhurried hands of a surgeon who had been a boy at Antietam and who had never, he liked to say, met a wound that was worse than what he had seen before breakfast on September 17th, 1862. He probed the shoulder, he clucked his tongue. He sent Wyatt to fetch hot water and set Bess to tearing clean sheets, and he took a curved needle and a length of waxed silk thread out of his black bag, and he stitched Silas Calloway's left shoulder closed in 23 neat stitches while Silas gripped Cordelia's hand hard enough to bruise and did not make a sound. Constitution of a grizzly, the doctor muttered, at one point not to anyone in particular. He kept stitching. When he was done, he washed his hands in a basin, and he rolled down his sleeves, and he turned to Cordelia. Ma'am, he said, your husband is not going to die today. He is going to be in that bed 2 weeks. He will be weak for 2 months. He will carry that scar to his grave. His good hand is going to lift a coffee cup by Wednesday and a rifle by Easter. You understand me? I understand, Cordelia said. Good, said Whitby. Now, where's the other one? Amos limped over and presented his thigh. Whitby looked at the bullet hole. He cut the trouser open. He examined the entry and exit. He snorted. Son, he said, your leg is insulted. It is not wounded. Sit. He stitched Amos in 12 stitches. He poured iodine. Amos howled once politely for the benefit of Bess Finley, who was standing in the door watching. It was almost 6 in the morning, and a thin gray dawn was beginning to show in the windows of the depot when the second crisis of the day came. A boy ran in from the street. Riders, he panted. 12 riders, coming up the Oak Haven Trail. I seen them from the north turn. Leader is tall, black coat, white horse. Cordelia went to the window. Down Silver Cliff's Main Street, cutting a line through the pale pre-dawn road, Thaddeus Crow. He was at the head of his own posse this time. 12 men, hired guns most of them. 2 she recognized from the Silver Keg. 3 were strangers with the long coats and second-grade boots of men who rented themselves by the week. The rest were thugs from down the valley who had seen Oak Haven's sheriff refuse to swear them in and had come anyway for $1 a head. Crow rode in front of them on a tall black saddle horse with a new Winchester repeater across his saddlebow. His face, even at this distance and in this light, was the face of a man who had been riding angry since nightfall and whose anger had cooled into something colder and more dangerous. He drew up in front of the Western Union Depot. He did not dismount. Cordelia, he called. His voice rolled down the quiet street. He was smiling. It was the smile he had used in Boston in his letters, a polished, reasonable smile, and it was the most frightening thing about him. Cordelia, darling, come on out now. We will forget about the little misunderstanding up the mountain. I will take you home. You have had your adventure. Come on. Behind her at the stove, Silas moved. She put her hand flat on his chest. No, she said softly without looking at him. This one is mine. She walked to the door of the depot. She opened it. She stepped out onto the boardwalk. Dawn was coming up behind her over the eastern ridges. It put her shadow long and thin out into the muddy street. She had not changed clothes in 36 hours. Her flannel shirt had a sleeve torn off at the shoulder where she had cut it for a bandage the night before. Her hair had come loose from the pins Wyatt had given her, and it hung the color of honey poured through glass in the new sun down her back. The Schofield was on her hip. She had checked the loads at 5 in the morning. Silas came to the door behind her. Wyatt beside him, Amos beside them, Bess beside Amos. Thaddeus Crow, Cordelia said. Her voice was clear. It carried. You have come to the wrong town. Crow laughed. It was a confident laugh. Sweetheart, he said, I have 12 men behind me and an attorney in Denver and a judge in my pocket. You have 3 mountain boys and a saloon girl, and you are in your nightshirt. Let me spell out your options. I would like to spell out yours, Cordelia said. She smiled. It was a small, pleasant Boston smile. Mr. Fenwick inside this building has just finished transmitting over official Western Union wire 4 signed letters in your handwriting detailing the bribery of federal judge Moses Howlett of Denver and 2 territorial land officers. The same wire transmitted an inventory of your mining operation at the Widowmaker claim, which as of yesterday is at the bottom of 80 tons of granite, along with your foreman, Mr. Vandermeer. A train carrying United States Marshal David Neagle and 6 federal deputies left Denver at 1:45 this morning. It is due in Silver Cliff at 7:11. That is in about 50 minutes. The hired guns behind Crow, who had been slouched in their saddles, began one by one to straighten. Governor Pitkin, Cordelia said, and she let the name sit there in the cold air, the way you let a good Shakespeare line sit, has personally authorized the arrest of any person interfering with that service of process. Those of you who ride with this man after today will hang with him. Those of you who ride away in the next 2 minutes will be free men at breakfast. A long silence. One of the riders, a tall man with a missing ear and a long scar down the side of his jaw. The kind of man, Silas said later, who had been shot at by professionals and had taken the lesson to heart. He leaned forward in his saddle and he spat tobacco into the street and he looked at Cordelia and he said loud enough to carry. Ma'am, he said, is that Silas Calloway behind you? It is. He was at Vicksburg, the man said. He was. Mr. Crow, the man said, without turning his head. You did not tell us there was a Calloway in this. He reined his horse around. He walked at 20 paces down Main Street. He did not look back. The second man followed him inside of a minute. The third and fourth followed. The next 3 turned as one. 2 more argued briefly and left. By the time the church bell up the street rang 6:30, Thaddeus Crow sat alone on his tall black horse in the middle of Main Street, and his 12 hired guns were gone. He looked up at Cordelia on the boardwalk. His face had changed. The polished, reasonable thing was gone. What was underneath was what had always been underneath. A small, cruel animal with an expensive hat on. He reached for the Winchester across his saddle bow. Delia, Silas said behind her, very quiet. She did not turn. I see him, she said. She had practiced an hour a day for 10 days. She had fired the Schofield at tin cans on a stump and at a flour sack hung from a pine limb and at a knot in a board at 20 paces. She had learned the grip in the stance and the breath. She had been told by the best instructor a woman could have been given that she would never have to do this. She drew. She drew low from the hip the way Silas had not taught her because Silas had not thought she would need to. It came up out of her hand the way a thing comes out that the hand already knows. Thaddeus Crow had the Winchester half raised. His right hand was on the grip. His finger was on the trigger. She did not try to kill him. She aimed at his hand. The Schofield bucked once. The report rolled down Main Street and came echoing back from the brick front of the bank. Crow's right hand came apart in a small red cloud. The Winchester spun out of it, end over end, and clattered on the frozen mud of the street. Crow screamed. He looked at the stump of his trigger finger. He looked at her. You, he said. He swayed. He fell off the saddle. He hit the mud of Silver Cliff's Main Street at 10 minutes after 6 on the morning of November the 18th, 1879, and he did not get up. At 7:11, the morning train from Denver came in. Marshal David Neagle stepped off in a long gray coat with a federal star on the breast. 6 deputies behind him, a slim young assistant attorney from the governor's office with a leather portfolio. Neagle was a spare gray man in his late 40s who spoke slowly and moved slowly and whose eyes missed nothing in a room. He shook Silas Calloway's good hand. "Calloway," he said, "I know your name. You had the sniper's company at Vicksburg in '63. I did." "This country owes you some back pay," Marshal Neagle said. He smiled very briefly. He turned to Cordelia. "Mrs. Ashby, the governor sends his regards. Show me your evidence if you would be so kind." She showed him the evidence. Thaddeus Crowe was in irons by 8 o'clock. The deputy attorney, a young man named Pennington, took Cordelia aside at 9. With his leather portfolio open on his knee and his pen poised, and he explained to her in a gentle, professional voice that the ledger Bess Finley had delivered, combined with Crowe's own handwritten letters, was the most complete case of territorial fraud he had seen in 6 years of prosecution. He explained that the widowmaker claim through the bankruptcy proceedings of the Crowe estate would revert to federal sale. He explained that Mrs. Ashby, as the wrong party, would have a priority claim at that sale. He explained last of all that the so-called marriage in the back room of the Oak Haven assayer's office, performed without a license recorded in a private ledger by a defrocked preacher whose name was in Crowe's pay ledger, had never been legal. The territory did not recognize it. The federal government did not recognize it. Her name had never been Cordelia Crowe. It was Cordelia Ashby. It had always been Cordelia Ashby. She sat very still. She put her hand over her mouth, and then she began very quietly to cry. Silas, from the cot where Dr. Whitby had him pinned by order, reached up with his good right hand and closed it around her wrist, and he did not say anything at all, because some things do not need saying. They stayed in Silver Cliff 3 weeks. Dr. Whitby would not let Silas be moved before that. Amos chafed at the inaction and took long walks up the creek with Bess Finley, and came back from these walks with a face that gave away nothing to his brothers and everything to Cordelia, who had been a woman exactly 3 weeks longer than Bess had been one. Wyatt found the library at the Silver Cliff courthouse and spent long afternoons reading judgments with a frown. Cordelia noticed, went out each morning to the little greenhouse behind the school and came back with a single sprig of rosemary, which he laid on Bess's pillow when no one was looking. On the 20th day, Silas walked Cordelia to the bank of the Silver Creek. It was a bright, cold afternoon. The creek ran black and clear between borders of new ice. The Sangre de Cristo peaks rose to the west, gold in the late sun. Silas had his left arm in a clean cotton sling. He had shaved. His beard was trimmed close to the jaw. He had on a clean blue wool shirt Bess had bought him at the mercantile. He stopped at a flat rock. He turned to her. "Delia," he said, "I am 16 years older than the boy who went to Vicksburg, and 15 years older than you are now. I have got one bad shoulder that is going to predict weather for me until I die. I have got 2 brothers in a mountain and a burned cabin I am going to rebuild by my own hands. I have got some small savings and a trap line and half a good mine that the federal government is about to sell back to us cheap. I cannot offer you Boston parlors, and I would not if I could, because the last time you lived in one, you came out of it 2,000 miles and a world away. What I can offer you is a log house built for you, not for a woman 10 years buried. I can offer you every morning of the rest of my life, starting with coffee. I can offer you that every word I say to you will be true until the day I go into the ground. And I can offer you a promise I already made on a muddy street in Oak Haven and mean to keep. You're home now, darling. You will be home until I die. Will you marry me?" He took something out of his pocket. It was a small ring. Wyatt had made it. It was the last of the silver Amos had pocketed from the blown chamber in the mine, drawn out by Wyatt's own hands over a charcoal forge in the back of the Silver Cliff smithy. Set in the band, polished for 3 evenings by thumb and cloth, was a single small stone Wyatt had pried from a creek bed above the burned cabin the week after they came down. It was a sapphire raw rough cut. It was the exact color of cornflowers in a Boston garden in June. It was the color of her eyes. Cordelia Ashby looked at the ring. She looked at the man. She looked at the Colorado sky that had been the color of old iron the day she met him, and was now the color of a bright hardbell struck clean. Yes, she said. She said it 1,000 times in her head before she said it once. Yes, Silas Calloway. 1,000 times yes. And yes again. He bent his head. He kissed her. It was a first kiss. It was a good one. It was gentle and it was brief and it was salt with the tears both of them were quietly shedding. And when he straightened up, Amos Calloway, who had been watching from behind a clump of willow 100 yards off because Amos Calloway had not been able to stand waiting in the boarding house, fired 2 pistol shots into the clean cold air over the Sangre de Cristo peaks to announce to God and to Silver Cliff and to the entire state of Colorado that the eldest Calloway brother had been at long last delivered. Fade to soft light. They were married 3 weeks later on the 20th of December, 1879, at the edge of the frozen Calloway Lake. The Reverend Obadiah Hollister, circuit preacher out of Silver Cliff, a tall, thin man with white hair and hands that still tended his own wheat field in the spring, rode up the new trail Amos had cleared. He had brought with him his daughter, Miss Prudence Hollister, the school teacher at Silver Cliff Academy. She was 28 and quiet and carried a small bunch of dried goldenrod that she would leave on the table of the new cabin as a gift. She did not know that day that the youngest Calloway brother would carve her a black walnut comb by the following September and would propose at the same creek bend in the May, after that under a Colorado sun, with a ring also made in a forge by his own hands. She did not know, but Cordelia watched Wyatt watch Prudence dismount, and Cordelia smiled. The new cabin was half built. The foundation was laid. The walls were up to the second course of logs. Silas had set the hearthstone himself on the 1st of December with one arm in a sling because he said the hearthstone of a home should be laid by the man who meant to grow old at its fire. Bess and Cordelia stood as witnesses for each other. Amos stood beside Silas as best man. Wyatt played Shenandoah on the mouth harp, while Cordelia came down the cleared snow path on the arm of Dr. Ambrose Whitby, who had insisted loudly that if he could not give the bride away as a proper surrogate father, he would go home to Silver Cliff and sulk for a week. The vows were simple. Silas said them first. He said them like a man keeping a promise. He said, I, Silas Calloway, take thee, Cordelia Ashby, to be my wife, to love, to honor, to provide, to protect, from this day until the day I am laid in Colorado ground. A man keeps his word. Cordelia said hers in a voice that was steady all the way through. I, Cordelia, Ashby, take thee, Silas Calloway, to be my husband, to love, to honor, to stand beside, to hold together, from this day until the day I am laid in Colorado ground. A woman keeps her word. The Reverend Hollister pronounced them married. Amos let out a whoop. Wyatt played Amazing Grace slow. Bess Finley wept into a handkerchief Prudence Hollister had quietly pressed into her hand 2 minutes earlier. Silas Calloway kissed his wife. That night in the half-finished cabin, with the snow falling past the new window glass, and the fire laid, and Amos and Wyatt and Bess tactfully spending the evening at the Whitby house down in Silver Cliff. Silas closed the door, fade to black, and in the morning when the sun came up on Calloway Lake, in a sky so blue it hurt the eyes, everything was different between them. 6 weeks after that, on a cold February evening, by the new fire, Amos Calloway took Bess Finley's hands in his own, and he asked her with more nerves on him than he had showed at any gunfight in his life, if she would consider taking a Calloway name. She said yes before he had finished the sentence, and then she said it again slower so he could hear it properly. They married in the spring. Prudence Hollister stood up with Bess. Silas stood up with Amos. Cordelia played a borrowed fiddle because the piano would not arrive from Denver for another 2 years. The following May, as Cordelia had guessed, Wyatt Calloway walked Prudence Hollister up the creek to the flat rock. He did not give a speech. He handed her a silver ring with a small garnet in it and a sprig of rosemary. She looked at him and she laughed and she said yes, and Wyatt Calloway, the quiet one, the youngest, whose courtship had been rosemary on a pillow and a carved comb, closed his eyes and exhaled like a man setting down a weight he had not known he was carrying. The winters came and went as winters do, as winters always do, As Bess Finley had once whispered in a pantry in a town that was now a name on a map and nothing more. In November of 1880, Cordelia and Silas's first child was born, a boy. They called him Edmund Silas Calloway after her father. Silas held him for the first time at 3 in the morning, then on his own hearthstone, and his large, scarred hands shook in a way they had never shaken on a rifle. And he looked at Cordelia in the bed and he said only darling. In 1881, Amos and Bess had a daughter. Bess had asked Cordelia carefully whether Silas would mind if they named her Martha. And Cordelia had asked Silas, and Silas had gone out to the woodshed and had not come back for an hour. And when he came back, his eyes were wet but steady, and he had said, yes, Bess. Name her Martha. Martha would like that. In 1882, Wyatt and Prudence married. They did not live on the mountain. Wyatt opened a smithy and a small dry goods store on Silver Cliffs Main Street, and he and Prudence lived above the store, and their children were raised with 1 foot in town and 1 foot in the high country. Wyatt was in the mountains most weekends. Prudence came to the Calloway Lake every summer with a trunk of books. In 1883, the new cabin, at last complete, was the largest and warmest building for 40 miles in any direction. It had 4 bedrooms. It had a glass front porch that looked east over the frozen lake. It had in the parlor a piano, a Chickering upright, shipped by rail to Denver and hauled up the mountain by 8 mules under Amos's personal supervision in a week-long expedition that nearly killed 3 of the mules and did kill one of Amos's boots. Cordelia played it every Sunday afternoon. She played Chopin. She played hymns. She played sometimes for Silas a slow version of Lorena that had been his favorite of Wyatt's harmonica tunes in the old cabin. In 1885, Lillian Rose Calloway was born. Red hair from some great-grandmother of Cordelia's in the Ashby line 2 generations back, which made Amos laugh for a week because the child looked more like his own wife than like her actual mother. In the same year, Amos and Bess had twin boys, Silas and Silver and Wyatt, and Prudence's first daughter, Grace, was born in Silver Cliff. In 1887, the winter broke records. The storm ran 3 weeks. They lost 7 head of cattle, a chicken coop, and nearly for an afternoon the tip of Silas's left forefinger to frostbite. Cordelia took it off herself at the first joint with a knife she had held in a stove flame because Silas could not reach it with his right hand alone, and the infection had reached the nail. He did not cry out. He waited until she had closed the stump with black silk and bear grease, and then he pulled her down onto the bed beside him, and he said, his voice breaking, Delia, Delia, Delia. I would not have gotten through that with any other woman on this earth. And she said, a man keeps his word, Silas Calloway. A woman does too. In 1890, Thaddeus Crowe died in the Cannon City Territorial Prison of tuberculosis. The Territorial Marshal's Office sent word by wire. Cordelia read the telegram twice. She walked out onto the new cabin's glass porch. She stood looking at the high country for 10 minutes. Then she rode down the mountain with Silas beside her. They found the unmarked grave on the prison hillside. She laid on it a small stone she had carried up from the Calloway Lake. She spoke aloud to it. Thaddeus Crowe, she said, I forgive you. Not because you earned it, because I am not going to carry you in my heart another day. She turned away. She and Silas rode home. In 1891, their 3rd child was born, a boy, Joseph Amos Calloway. In 1893, their last, a girl, Mary Prudence Calloway, after the school teacher her mother had quietly adored. The children grew. Edmund Silas went east to Harvard College at 19 and came back with a law degree from Denver 3 years later and opened a practice that within 10 years would be the largest in southern Colorado. Lillian Rose trained as a school teacher and took over Silver Cliff Academy from Prudence in 1906, when Prudence retired to help raise the Wyatt Calloway grandchildren. Joseph managed the ranch that grew up around the Calloway Lake after the federal sale of the Widowmaker, 4,000 acres, 300 head of cattle, the best spring water in the county. Mary married a young doctor from Pueblo, and when she came home with her new husband at Christmas and Dr. Ambrose Whitby, still going strong in his 70s, sat across from the young doctor, and quizzed him on surgical technique until the young doctor started to perspire. Everyone in the cabin laughed, and even Silas, who was 54 by then, and careful of his shoulder when he laughed until he wheezed. By 1909, they were all still living. Silas was 68, Cordelia was 53. They had been married 30 years. There were 8 grandchildren on Callaway Lake that autumn. There were 16, counting Amos and Bess's 6, and the 10 of them that Wyatt and Prudence had raised on top of the Silver Cliff smithy. On the first Sunday of October 1909, the 3 Callaway brothers and their wives and all 24 of the children and grandchildren gathered at the lake house because that was the tradition the first Sunday of October every year, as long as the sun came up over the Sangre de Cristo. Silas stood in the doorway that afternoon with his coffee cooling in his hand. He watched his children and his brother's children and his grandchildren chase each other through the late Indian paintbrush in the meadow. The flowers were red as blood on their stalks. A small girl 5 years old with honey-colored hair and blue eyes almost the exact color of cornflowers came up on the porch and tugged his trouser leg. She had been born in Denver and named at Cordelia's quiet insistence Delia. "Grandpa," she said. "Grandma, Delia said, tell you supper is on." Silas Callaway, slow now, careful with his knees in the cold, smiled down at her. "Little Delia, he said you tell Grandma Delia I am coming directly." The child looked up at him. She was solemn. "Grandpa," she said, "how did you and Grandma meet?" Silas Callaway set down his coffee on the porch rail. He lowered himself with a small grunt into the rocking chair Wyatt had built him for his 60th birthday. He reached out one large scarred hand and lifted the child up onto his knee. "Little Delia," he said, "it is a long story. It started in a muddy street in a town you will never see, because that town is not there anymore. And it ended the day your father was born, which was the best day of my life. And in between, it has all of the things a good story has in it. Courage, a sorry man who came to a bad end, a silver mine, a storm, a fire, and 3 brothers and the best woman any one of them ever saw in the mountain that chose her for us." "The mountain chose Grandma," the child repeated. She was very serious. "It did," Silas said. "And your grandma chose us back every day of 30 years. He kissed the top of her honey-colored head. He carried her inside to the kitchen, where Cordelia was pulling biscuits out of the same Dutch oven that had come down the mountain burning in 1879 and been salvaged the following spring from the cabin's ashes and repaired by Wyatt and put back in service with the first signature soap in the pantry bearing Cordelia's initials and a date. Cordelia looked up when her husband and her granddaughter came through the door. Her hair was silver now mostly. Her eyes were still cornflower blue. She smiled at him across 30 years. "You're home now, darling," she said. He smiled back. "I am," he said. 2 autumns later, on a September afternoon that was so gold in the aspens above Callaway Lake, it hurt the eyes to look at them. Silas Callaway sat on the glass porch of the cabin he had built with his brothers and his wife. He was 70. He had not picked up a rifle in 2 years. His beard had gone silver and then gone white. Dr. Whitby, who was past 90 now, but who still came up every summer to go fishing, had warned him that the left lung was tired. He had told Cordelia that spring. Cordelia had already known. Amos and Bess were coming up the path from their own cabin below the ridge. They were 66 and 52. Amos limped a little from the bullet, a quarter-century old. Bess's red hair was silver at the temples. They held hands. Wyatt and Prudence had come up from Silver Cliff the night before. Wyatt was 62. He still had hands that could shape iron like it was warm butter. Prudence was 60 and still read a book a week. The 8 grandchildren were out in the meadow. The Indian paintbrush was red as always. The mountain was the mountain. Silas reached out and took Cordelia's hand. Her hand was small and old and lined. His was large and scarred and old. "They fit, Delia," he said. "Yes. Do you remember the day you stepped off the stagecoach?" "I remember," she said softly, "the day I knelt in the mud. That was the day that mattered. Because that was the day you came. 32 years ago, Silas said. 32 years, she agreed. Do you want to go back to Boston, darling? She looked at him. She looked at the aspens. She looked at the grandchildren. She looked at the man she had loved for 32 years and whose hand she was holding and whose lungs she knew the way. A wife knows such things we're not going to see another spring. Silas Calloway, she said. I left Boston 32 years ago as a Boston girl with a trunk full of lies. I came to Oak Haven as a mail-order bride. I left the Widowmaker as a survivor. But I did not know what the word home meant until the day you put your hand down to me in the mud. The mountain chose me. For you. And I chose you. Every day of 32 years. And I would choose you 1,000 times and 1,000 times after that if the good Lord would let me. Silas Calloway lifted her hand to his mouth. He kissed the palm. The same palm he had kissed first on a ridge above a burning mine on a winter dusk a lifetime ago. You're home now, darling, he whispered. I am, she whispered back. And somewhere on the ridge above the cabin, a great horned owl called long and low, the way great horned owls had been calling on that mountain since before there were Calloways on it, and somewhere below in the meadow, a child that a child of hers had made laughed in the paintbrush, and Silas Calloway, who had been a sniper at Vicksburg and a widower at 28 and a mountain man for 10 silent years and a husband for 32, closed his eyes for a moment in the afternoon sun and was at last wholly and entirely at peace. Cordelia Ashby Calloway remembered stepping off that stagecoach in Oak Haven all her life. She remembered the mud and the pearl-handled revolver and the smell of old whiskey in a 10-by-12 room. She remembered a pantry and a tin cup of warm water and a red-haired girl who had said winter always ends. She remembered a hand coming down through the snow. She remembered the slow climb up a switchback road behind an Appaloosa called Sargent. She remembered the first smile of a man who had not smiled in 10 years. And she remembered always standing on the porch of a log house on a mountain in Colorado with a small silver-haired sister of her heart beside her and 3 brothers whose word had been good for 32 years and the sound of her own grandchildren laughing in a meadow. And she thought the way she had thought every year of her long life since the year 1879. These words in her mother's voice, in her father's voice, in her own. That was the day my life began. A man keeps his word. A woman keeps hers too. Winter always ends. And the mountain in its old wisdom chooses whom it chooses, and those it has chosen are not let go.